listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is now time for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events in those states. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get into the news this morning. Today is Election Day. As many of you know, the polls are finally open. Nearly 100 million Americans have already, however, cast a ballot in early voting. Among the early voters were President Trump and his Democratic opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., who both decided to forgo the traditional Election Day photo op at the polls. President Trump on Monday attacked the Supreme Court on several occasions during his final full day of campaigning before Election Day, accusing it of putting, quote, our country in danger, end quote, with its Friday ruling, which would allow Pennsylvania to continue accepting absentee ballots after Election Day, at least for the time being. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, the fourth of 5 rallies across 4 states, Mr. Trump told a crowd that the justices had made a political decision that would lead to cheating by his opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden Jr. His comments followed an angry tweet in which he charged that the court's decision would allow rampant and unchecked cheating and induce violence in the streets. Twitter quickly flagged that assertion as potentially false, saying that, quote, some or all of the content shared in this tweet is disputed and might be misleading. Meanwhile, Joe Biden closed his presidential campaign in Western Pennsylvania on Monday, concluding with a drive-in rally outside a football stadium in Pittsburgh. It was the second straight day that Mr. Biden held a nighttime rally in his childhood home state, highlighting the critical role that Pennsylvania may play in determining the outcome of today's election. And it was a full circle moment for Biden, who gave the first speech of his presidential campaign at a union hall in Pittsburgh. Before we move on, Jamarl, that's the contrast. Twin rallies in different states, although Trump also had a rally in Pennsylvania. One thing that we talked about briefly in there that we haven't talked about yesterday was the Supreme Court ruling on Friday about Pennsylvania. Any thoughts on that?
What do you mean that is allowing those to go later?
Exactly, allowing absentee ballots after Election Day. That's the kind of thing that I could see getting messy. You know, I could see that. Not the ruling itself, but just with USPS slowing down and with ballots coming in late.
Well, let me.
It's very unlikely that we're going to get today.
Why is USPS slowing down?
Largely, probably because of funding problems and institutional incompetence. Both of those things, like built up corruption over years.
Well,
and
does it have anything
also,
to do with DeJoy
lack of funding
coming in and
probably
screwing stuff up?
Yeah, probably that too. Yeah, that's probably a big thing. It's not getting enough money, and
that's not just a probably. Like, it's understood as a flat fact that DeJoy royally screwed things up, and he put in action things in order to slow the mail down for the explicit purpose of screwing up the election. He said it. I mean, Trump said it as much as like, yeah, we're gonna, those elections, we're gonna slow down the mail. I mean, Donald Trump has been talking about this stuff himself. The mail. If Louis DeJoy has made it his mission apparently to destroy or screw up the mail, and when he was slowing down trucks and all of this other stuff, those things as consequences. The reason why the judge kept saying, hey, unchain the sorters and push those people back to their normal time is because when DeJoy put those changes, the thing that it was going to screw up was going to be the election. I mean, you see that, right? That's not a regular mail thing. That's a DeJoy making it that way thing.
Yeah, that was definitely true a few months ago. And luckily, we're going to be speaking with Chuck Zlatkin in a little bit over an hour, legislative and political director for the New York Metro Area Postal Union. So we will definitely be coming back to this exact conversation. And
I guess
can have it in some more depth
this
a
is the
little
point
bit
that
later.
I'm making. If you put somebody in a box, and then when they're in that box, you ask them to make a choice. The choices are always going to be bad. This is the cop argument. It's like you throw cops in a community. It's like, well, no, we don't want to deal with the issues of poverty and alienation and stuff like that. So we're just going to throw in cops. We're going to pay poor people to police poor people. And there are no good outcomes. There's no cops have no faculty to fix the situations that they're presented with. Same thing with Fauci. Same thing. Fauci, they put him in a box. They put the other services in our country in the box, like the CDC and whatnot. And these guys are now trying to make a choice.
But who is the they?
But wait.
Who is the they?
I'm talking about Trump, meaning from the standpoint of the government not taking particular action that was necessary to ensure that everybody had what they needed.
Is it Trump or is it the government?
It's the
because
government.
if it's Trump, then a lot of these.
But Trump is head of the government, Shane. He's the executive.
Yeah, I get you. But here's what I'm saying. All I said was probably. I didn't even say no. I'm saying there's probably both like long-term institutional problems in the USPS and as well as like this most recent crisis having to do with the joy. But I don't know. I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to accept a sort of blanket humility that I should bring to most issues because I don't frankly know what I'm talking about a lot of this stuff. I'm still researching it. I'm still getting up to speed, just like most people are. You know?
No, I understand. I'm not attacking you. At least that's what I don't think I am. At least I don't think I'm trying to. I apologize if I'm sorry. I'm stopped up.
No, you're good.
But
good. We got a whole bunch more headlines to get through. We spent a couple minutes on this one. No, you're totally good. Voters in Colorado and Louisiana will be deciding on ballot measures that promise to shape the future of abortion access in their respective states, both in the short and the long term. Those efforts represent what many experts say is the future of abortion rights in America, a state-by-state battle over the procedure as the fate of Roe v. Wade becomes less certain under a conservative Supreme Court. In Colorado, voters on Tuesday will consider Prop 115. That's a ballot measure that would prohibit abortion after 22 weeks of pregnancy. The proposal offers only one exception if an abortion is, quote, immediately required to save the life of the pregnant woman when her life is physically threatened, end quote, according to the text of that proposition. The ban doesn't offer exceptions for victims of rape or incest or in situations of severe fetal abnormalities, conditions that typically aren't detectable until later in a pregnancy. In Louisiana, meanwhile, voters will consider a ballot measure that's more hypothetical, an amendment to the state constitution opposing abortion. If passed, that measure, Louisiana Amendment Number 1, the No Right to Abortion in Constitution Amendment, would add one line to the state's Declaration of Rights. That line reads, to protect human life, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to secure or protect a right to abortion or require the funding of abortion. So two larger changes that might be decided on ballots in those states today. In New York, the New York City Police Department put known rioters on notice ahead of Election Day as the city braced for possible protests over Tuesday's presidential contest. Quote, our intel has gotten a lot better. Our responses to getting cops out to the scene has gotten a lot better, end quote. That is the New York Chief of Police, Terrence Monahan, speaking Monday about the protests that raged in the city over the summer. Quote, we've identified those who are willing to cause damage and destruction, and we will be on them. We know who they are, end quote. That is menacing sounding. We will be on them. But, you know, if you're a cop and you're trying to prevent potential civil destruction or whatever, that kind of thing, I guess I get where he's coming from. The other side of this, though, is how are they going to be on them? What exactly does that mean? Are they tracking them? What tools are they tracking them with? We've briefly talked before about police surveillance programs, of which there are a few, and like what technology, what tools they're using, you know, infringements on civil liberties. That's a whole other side of that conversation that very quickly gets very dystopic. Anyway, in worldwide COVID news, there have been 46.9 million COVID cases, 31.4 million of those people have recovered, and 1.21 million have died globally. The UK has recorded over 1,038,000 COVID cases and 46,800 deaths. That's according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. Reports are currently swirling there that Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, and second in line to the throne, contracted COVID in April. Apparently, he was treated by palace doctors and isolated at home and struggled breathing at one point. He remained active throughout his royal engagements at the time. His father, Prince Charles, also tested positive for coronavirus in the spring. And in addition to those royals, Prime Minister Boris Johnson also battled the virus in the spring. Johnson became the first world leader to announce he had contracted COVID-19 in March. He was admitted to the hospital, then transferred to the ICU in April, but he is now recovered. As we were talking about yesterday in Kabul, gunmen stormed the campus of Kabul University in Afghanistan's capital on Monday morning, forcing thousands of students to flee in a panic and leaving almost 20 people dead before security forces regained control. An unclear number of students were taken hostage by the assailants during the chaotic, hours-long siege. But officials said later that 3 attackers had been killed and that the attack was over. Still, 3 attackers killed, almost 20 people dead, and thousands of students disrupted. I'm sure just the whole city was on high alert. That's sadly effective. That's a brutal situation. And you think a kid, you think being like an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old dealing with that, it's just not good. Anyway, former U.S. security contractor Edward Snowden said Monday that he and his wife intended to apply for Russian citizenship without renouncing their U.S. citizenship. That would be dual citizenship, of course. Snowden, a former contractor with the U.S. National Security Agency, has been living in Russia since 2013 to escape prosecution in the U.S. after leaking classified documents detailing government surveillance programs. He was granted permanent residency last month, his Russian lawyer said. Snowden's wife, Lindsay Mills, an American who has been living with them in Russia, announced last week that the couple are expecting a child. According to Snowden's lawyer, the child, a boy, will be born in December and will have Russian citizenship. Snowden will be able to get a Russian passport without renouncing his U.S. nationality after Russia, earlier this year, relaxed its strict citizenship laws. Previously, the law required foreigners to renounce other nationalities in order to get Russian citizenship. In Vienna, see the headlines just keep on going. 5 people died, including an assailant, and 17 others were wounded in a shooting in the heart of Vienna hours before a coronavirus lockdown started, Austrian authorities said Tuesday. The dead attacker was a 20-year-old Austrian North Macedonian dual national who had a previous terror conviction. 2 men and 2 women died from their injuries in that attack Monday evening. The suspected attacker was shot and killed by police. Vienna's hospital service said 7 people were in life-threatening condition Tuesday after the attack, and in total 17 people were being treated in hospitals with gunshot wounds, but also cuts. A prominent NSARS protester, Anthony Unuode, was murdered during a demonstration. The protests were held under the NSARS banner. This is in Nigeria, a reference to demands for the disbandment of the notorious Special Anti-Robbery Squad, whose officers were repeatedly accused of criminal activity ranging from extortion to extrajudicial killings. Unuode has been very active in the protests. When thugs suspected to be hired by politicians to crush protests attacked them on the 13th of October at the Burger Roundabout, Unuode stepped forward and shielded those he could, escaping with a minor injury on his arm. 4 days later, the thugs launched another attack with machetes, daggers, and wooden sticks to disrupt a march along Abuja's Kubwa Expressway. It is unclear whether Anthony was among the marchers or just happened to be walking in the area, but he suffered deep machete wounds to his head, and again was killed due to those wounds. At our last headline here, the dangerous and powerful Hurricane Eta turned toward Nicaragua's Caribbean coast with potentially devastating winds early this morning, while heavy rains from its outer bands were already causing rivers to overflow across Central America. That is a Category 4 hurricane. It has sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, and the U.S. National Hurricane Center in Miami warned that Eta could strengthen further, perhaps reaching a catastrophic Category 5 before it makes landfall today. The government said that more than 3,000 families were taken to shelters from the most at-risk areas. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break, and we will be back in just a minute with Jamarl's monologue, giving his news and incisive thoughts on an issue today. Back on the other side, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station at Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you consume us on, give us a like and definitely share the content. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, don't be scared. You can jump in with a chat, a tweet, and of course a phone call. 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Here we are. One of these men will become president of the United States, and one will go home in utter and complete humiliation. A walk of shame with a gravity that is unprecedented. From my standpoint, I watch this, and I look at this through the lens of you know what? I'll tell you the lens I look at this through. My grandmother fell 3 times this year. And the first few times, if I'm being bluntly honest, I wasn't entirely paying attention to it. My wife and I had been traveling and stuff like that. We get back home. And I think that everything else is being handled by my mom. I think my mom got it. She's in luck. And she uses Herculean strength to try to deal with the situation. Now, this is the same mom that had to deal with a kid who was sick and who had the burden of, trying to find a job where she's not paid all that well, and a kid that is very sick and that is in a hospital or that has to get a specialist or whatever. Well, she has to do the same thing now with her mom, with her, with my grandmother. Now, in trying to make sure that my grandmother is keeping intact and everything else, my mom, she believes that if she puts more energy into it, meaning if I can put Herculean strength into it, that I can fix it. And she thinks that because of me, because going back to the time when she was taking care of me, that was the way she was doing it. If she was in a foxhole, it was her and it was I. I didn't necessarily like the other people to know that I was ill. And for the most part, it often boiled down to just her and I. In the case of my grandmother, though, how does she deal with that? Herculean effort doesn't fix that. There's no situation where you can dedicate 24 hours of your time in order to fix or help someone. So your family members, those family members end up rotating. Now, just because a person wants to do something, meaning a person can have it in their conscious mind, I really want to do this, doesn't mean they can do it. And the stress of doing it wears on that particular individual. That person is not necessarily great at that job. And this is kind of what was taking place. The 2 family members weren't great at the job, and my grandmother didn't want to bother them because they must have been saying things, or they must have gotten across that they didn't necessarily want to be bothered, or they didn't necessarily like what they were doing. So in their case, so she decided, I'm going to do things on my own, and in doing things on her own, she's fallen. Now, this is terrifying. You could break something, you could hurt something. If she would have broken a leg, oh my God, any problems that she was having would have gotten infinitely worse. Now, how do you fix this? How do you fix this? In the situation to which my mom is in, she was never extremely well paid. She was one of those people that 42% of the population making $18,000 a year. That was her. So she can't buy a nurse. How do you deal with this? You don't. You can't. There is no way to square that circle without having cash to square that circle. Even if you get financial, like governmental assistance, the government still expects you to pay a chunk of money, $500 that she does not, and the majority of the population does not have. How do you fix that? Who fixes that? How does she deal with that situation? And that situation, I know as a flat fact, I know that situation is replicated to the tune of tens of millions of human beings who are trapped in the situation of how do I financially deal with this. I was able to get my mom a nurse. And because of that, it minds the gap. It expands the amount of time that my grandmother's covered. I was able to do that. But there's a lot of people who've lost their jobs. There's a lot of people who, let's say in retail businesses, that have gone belly up. Even before COVID hit, again, 42% of the population was making $18,000 a year. How do you deal with that on that salary? The catch and the point that I'm making here is politics. Schoolboy philosophy politics is that the person who fixes that gets my vote. Meaning the person who in my life comes up with a solution that says, yes, I got you. You're covered on that issue. That's politics. That's the person who gets their vote. The problem, in some respects, is that people have gotten so, let's say, privileged that those things aren't on the marquee. Those things aren't even up for the vote. The only thing that's up for this particular vote is, do you hate Trump? And so the issues like that my grandmother deals with are off the table. And if I'm being bluntly honest, wasn't on the table for the last, God knows how long, 40, 50 years. None of them would have fixed that very specific issue. All of them should have attended to it. Medicare for all would have fixed that specific issue. I'm making a very basic point that politics, as a schoolboy philosophy kind of way, is who fixes the issues in your community, especially when it's something that's visited on a large number of people in the community. Getting older is, I'm saying that just as an absolute, getting older is. And people in the family often have to stop what they're doing or have to do two things, whatever they're doing, in order to keep themselves stationary and the person. My uncle, who's in his 60s, and all of these people, meaning my mom is, all of these people are over their 60s. And so you have a situation where people who are supposed to be able to rest and retire and whatnot are stuck working with the extra burden of the family member, whether it's a kid like me or whether it's a parent. We've missed something in our politics. We've lost something in our politics, especially when people throw themselves at the candidate instead of having the candidate come and get your vote. There's a drastic difference between those two things, this inversion where the candidate just stands there and people are so terrified of one guy, they go running to the other guy. That needs to stop. We must get to the point as African American, as Hispanics, or whatever, that you hold the politician accountable. that there are times where politicians should fail when they're not living up to something that you consider to be objective of yourself or of a particular party. In this case, that's off the table. What you have is Trump, who is saying fire Fauci, and you have Biden, who doesn't have a care in the world. And you have all of these tens of millions of other people like my grandmother, who have all sorts of cares in the world. And many of those cares are entirely unreconcilable. The unfortunate, honest reality of it is, school board philosophy thing doesn't apply. Politics in the United States has been entirely inverted. So the issue, the bread and butter issues, the kitchen table issues of how do we pay for the house? Who's going to keep the house? How are we going to pay for the grandmother? Who's going to keep, how are we going to pay the bills? How are we going to deal with this particular rotation? Who's going to pay for the light bill? All of those things, bread and butter, things that people, that dig into people on a daily basis, off the table in this election. None of those things are going to get fixed. Shane, what do you think? I mean, from my standpoint, the bread and butter, the main issues, or the one that I care about anyway, the healthcare issue, is off the table. And if that's off the table in this particular election, well, then I don't have a dog in this hunt.
Yeah, I think, it clearly is off the table. It should be like at the center of the table. It should be the main thing that people are debating other than foreign policy when they're debating, because we're going through a medical crisis. We're dealing with a pandemic right now. That should be sort of top of people's minds and center of their attention, as particularly the president's. But it's not. I mean, you're talking about bread and butter issues. The other side of this, of course, is just economics and whether or not people are making enough money over the course of a lifetime to support themselves, at near the end of their lifetime. It's also, you can tie in other things like intergenerational wealth, whether you have strong community support networks so that, if I fail, there are other people to hold me up. If my mom fails, if my dad fails, if, my extended family, et cetera, people in my community, if they fail, I will be there to hold them up, that kind of thing. There are those dynamics too, but a lot of this stuff, frankly, comes down to what opportunities are afforded to people, what opportunities people have access to, how easy it is to make enough and to live in a society where you're going to be safe by the end of your life. Those are the bread and butter issues. And ultimately, all the debating that we do about politics back and forth on this sort of high abstract level is what it like decomposes into, what it's ultimately constructed of. It's another way of looking at this. Is those basic concerns. It's completely composed of whether or not at the end of your life you're going to be reasonably comfortable or reasonably taken care of, or whether early in life you have some reasonable hope of, having a family, maybe owning a house, not just being stuck in this perpetual situation of subservience to some economic authority that's going to constantly try to strip away whatever personal time you have. Those are those are real concerns, and those are the real concerns is another way of looking at it. And all the debate that we engage in over issues, over the problems that our society faces, those are just sort of high level representations of the material reality that you're describing. And I'm sorry to hear that stuff's going on, man.
I mean, it's life. It's part of life. I mean, I wasn't saying it in that sense. I was saying it more so to try to make this point that, these guys are out there throwing air at each other, not caring. And under the best of circumstances, I haven't even said anything about COVID. I'm talking, under the best of circumstances, my grandmother's case is replicated tens of thousands of millions. So it's not just her. I'm making the very basic point that neither of these two care about that specific issue. Neither of these two are going to deal with that issue. It never even comes up. I'm just astonished to the degree to which, real world phenomena, meaning the things that affect real human beings, don't seem to apply. And, you have people in Congress who are acting as if the poor want to be poor, despite the fact that many of these people are working jobs. The majority, in fact, are working jobs. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and our guest, Joel Siegel. Joel Siegel is a former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the expanded and improved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. Joel, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Normally I'd be playing my bass guitar before I started work, but when you guys called and asked me to be on the show, I had to put the funk away for a minute. And
oh man,
I think. By the way, I think your show and you two are two of the best broadcasters in journalism. I'm amazed at your analysis, your levity, and I'm honored to be on your show.
Oh man, well that's too kind to you, and you can feel free to bring your bass guitar on the show anytime. We would love to hear that funk, but that's maybe slightly off topic today. I hope we can. I want it. I definitely want the funk.
All right.
Yeah, Joel Siegel, thank you again for joining us. All right, big day today, Election Day 2020. I'll just start it off right here. We're obviously this conversation is going to go off into a bunch of different directions pretty quickly. What do you think is going to happen? I'll just start with the prognostication. Where do you think this is going to go?
I think there's going to be we've had more people vote in this election cycle, I think, than maybe since Obama's election. I think we're going to see really three things. One, people are going to be risking their lives, basically, to go vote because they care so much about getting rid of the Trump dictatorship. But we really need to call it what it is, and that's the Trump dictatorship. And today is a choice between democracy or authoritarianism.
Joel, just real quick, I hate to interrupt you, but you're voting in Trump's dictatorship? How do you vote in a dictatorship?
Well, it is a dictatorship, and I'll tell you why. I think the corporate media has not called it the Trump dictatorship. The progressive movement is calling it the Trump dictatorship. You have a dictatorship when the attorney general is no longer independent as a check and balance on power, the sovereign, the president, Donald Trump. You no longer have a free democracy when the far right wing of the Republican Party is openly contesting absentee ballots, when the Supreme Court Justice Alito issues an opinion that says, yeah, you can count the votes, but it's okay for states to set aside millions of absentee ballots. Why? So they can be contested by the far right wing Republican Party, thrown out. So the state legislatures, many of them will remain Republican, but the Senate remains Republican. This is unprecedented, except maybe in 2000 when the court unjustly and illegally certified an election between Al Gore and Bush. So yeah, it is a dictatorship. It's not a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a dictatorship of the American people, and we are already seeing hundreds of cases of voter suppression, voter intimidation. We had the Biden-Harris bus was on a highway, and 12, Trump thugs tried to run the truck off the road. We had people involved in a secessionist movement and insurrection against the governor of Michigan. They were plot to, kidnap her and kill her. And the president sanctioned it and said it was okay. That's called a dictatorship. There was this little guy called Adolf Hitler. And before he burned down the Reichstag, the Communist Party in Germany, everyone laughed at him. And then no one laughed after he killed 6 million Jews and, destroyed our planet with war. And yes, it is a dictatorship. And today is a choice between dictatorship and democracy. That's where we're at.
Dictatorship and democracy is extreme. Yeah. I mean, even talking about judges, like judges these things aren't organs necessarily of dictatorship, at least not in the way that they're functioning in the United States and regarding Trump. I understand you want to get Biden in office, but making the argument that this is some kind of dictatorship, come on. I mean, and you know what? And the sad part about that is that argument, the fact that argument needs to be made to get Joe Biden over the finish line, as opposed to some kind of aspirational argument of he's going to do X or he's going to do Y. Gets across the paucity of the candidate. I'm sorry. I mean, I wasn't even going to go into that. But
yesterday there was a press conference that there's a National Election Protection Coalition, and we had the president of LULAC. We had Maya Rockamore Cummings. We had, leaders from across the country who said the same thing. We have federal court judges who are picked by Donald Trump who are trying to disenfranchise millions of people. And the Attorney General, didn't say anything about it. Trump is encouraging it. Trump raised $20 million, hired 50,000 thugs to stop people from voting. Is it not a dictatorship when the President of the United States orders the head of the United States Postal Service to sabotage the post office so that the absentee ballots would come in late and not be counted?
I agree with you on that. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And Shane and I were arguing about it before the show came in on. Totally, 1,000% agree with you on. But you also have judges telling people to put those things back and make sure those things are functional. Now, whether they do it or not, who knows? I don't actually entirely believe that they're going to, I still believe there may be sabotage in that. So it's not that I disagree with you on that. It's more so disagreeing on the characterization. The characterization of it. I don't have the dog in the sun.
Can we agree? How about we do this? Can we agree to disagree? Because I'm not going to, as a lawyer and someone who's been in government for 40 years and someone who is an expert on constitutional law, I can tell you, I have never seen in my 61 years of my life have the President of the United States tell, those who are in charge of very important agencies an oath of loyalty, whether it was Comey and the FBI or Attorney General Barr. I've never seen this before. I've never seen Trump pick judges. I mean, I'll just give you an example. One judge in Texas tried to disenfranchise 127,000 voters, mainly Hispanic, Black, because they voted curbside.
Joe, I agree. 1,000% agree with you on. It's like, it's not that I disagree with you. It's not that I disagree with you on that, but that's been years. Democrats have stood by and watched Republicans do that for years. I've written articles before I started doing this. I used to write articles, like in Obama era, 2008. They were doing that. Al Gore was gaveling people down in the Congress who were trying to say that, look, they've disenfranchised 20,000, 30,000.
But Democrats have never, let me underscore that, they have never waged a war against democracy. You see, we have a party now that is anti-voter, and it's an anti-voting party. Now, this is an extreme far right-wing element that took over the party. There's books that have been written about this. Trump loves Putin. He loves the idea of unlimited power. Today's election is very simple. It's a vote for continued authoritarianism, not creeping. We're there, or democracy. But I would, prefer to move on.
It's amazing how authoritarian Trump is. He can't even get the budget deal out. Like, I understand the characterization you're trying to make, but the characterization doesn't work. Also, and I don't even want to sit here and defend Trump. I'm just saying this characterization doesn't work in order to get Biden over the finish line.
Let's agree to disagree. This is not about, it has nothing to do with democracy. I mean, Republican, Democrat. I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden, but my grandparents and my great-grandparents left Russia, where they were conscripting young Jewish boys and men into the army. They would take them to Siberia and shoot them and kill them. My great-grandparents and my grandparents did not come to this country after fleeing an authoritarian czar to be in a country where they're trying to steal the vote. Now, that's why you have the Lincoln Project. There's Republicans who have defected from their own party and are going against their own president because they are against caging children, right? Immigrant children. They're against that. They're against a party and a president that allows for authoritarian policies to go unchecked. And we're just not going to agree on this. I'm a lawyer. I believe in the Constitution. It should not be destroyed and torn up by a reality show president. And we the American people have to take to the streets and the suites. If he contests the election, which he says he's probably going to do, he won't concede, then we're going to have to force him and pressure him to concede. Today is a choice between democracy or dictatorship. Can you honestly tell me that the Attorney General Barr is neutral? No, he's not neutral at all. Can you honestly tell me that when our own Supreme Court Justice Alito issues an opinion and says, oh, yeah, you can count the absentee ballots, but we're going to take the absentee ballots and put them aside? Why? So they could be contested. This is not an independent Supreme Court. This is a Supreme Court which is siding with an authoritarian president.
Joel, I agree with you on all of that. Like that's the maddening part about this conversation, I think. I agree with you on all that stuff. That stuff is horrendous. And yeah, they've been taking provocative actions to try to screw with the election and to try to ensure that Trump gets in. And
the
Republicans, yes.
We have turned into a banana republic. And Americans who are listening to this show need to wake up and understand that our democracy, that we have people bled and died in the Bridge of Selma, the Civil Rights Movement, in World War II, we are a constitutional democracy. This is not about red state, blue state. It absolutely has nothing to do with getting Biden elected. This has to do with whether or not one person, one vote is still the integrity of the vote remains in this country. And right now, it is in jeopardy. And I will fight it until I can't breathe because it makes me sick. I'm angry. Millions of us are angry. And there are millions of people who are going to the polls to get rid of Donald Trump and to vote Republicans out of office because they see that we are inching closer and closer and closer to an authoritarian regime. We're not China. This is America. But I would love to move on. You and I we're not going to agree on this.
I don't even know what we're disagreeing on. That's the wild part. I agree.
I think it's
with everything.
Yeah, we've got to go into
with the exception of Trump and
the dictatorship part.
Yeah, I mean, but I agree with everything else.
What catches you up is it's that we've got to go into a break. I'm just going to jump in here. That's an interesting conversation. I fall down on one side of that. I don't think we live in a dictatorship, but I admit that a lot of this stuff is worrying. I mean, one thing going out, we don't have enough time to talk about this. Maybe we can talk about it on the other side. I also saw Biden's campaign manager saying that under no circumstances is Trump going to win this one. Under no circumstances. If Trump's campaign manager had said that, everybody in the establishment media would be calling, using that as evidence that he's a dictator. But what does it mean when Biden's campaign manager does it. I just see, I don't know. I see each side as pretty terrible in this one. Regardless, we're going to be back. We're talking with Joel Siegel, joined by him on the other side of this break. For those listening, Joel Siegel is a former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676. That is the expanded and improved Medicare for All bill. And he's one of the leading architects for the passage of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And he is co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, JAM. That is a nationwide multiracial climate action network. We'll be back with him in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, back on the other side of this break.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676 and one of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act. Joel, thank you again for being with us. If Biden wins, that's in some sense a return to a semblance of normalcy, not going back to any status quo. I don't think there is a status quo to go back to at this point. But after 2016, that was a major disjuncture in American politics. If Biden is elected in 2020, many will see that, and the reality may be that is a step back in the direction of a more normal America. But America, has its problems, has had its problems for a while. If he's elected, where do you want to take that presidency as an activist, as somebody who's looking at this from a political perspective, from sort of from the perspective of somebody who's been engaged in politics for decades at this point, a lot of experience? How would you try to use that? If there's a momentum there, how would you try to, use that momentum to push for what you want? Joel?
Yeah, by the way, I don't try to engage in any arguments. I hope this wasn't personal. I'm very passionate about democracy. So just want to make sure that if we disagree, we disagree as a family and as brothers in America. I'm not a fan of Joe Biden. However, I really like I'm as an environmental activist, 100% cleanable energy advocate and leader in this country. He has put forward one of the most progressive platforms I've ever seen in terms of understanding that climate change is not a hoax. He believes in science. So I really think that the progressive movement, first of all, has to unify, which it's not. It's very fragmented. That's what I'm trying to do, is try to unify the progressive movement so that it has true power, like King had power. The second issue is COVID-19. I think we'll see a very positive shift in our COVID-19 policy. Trump didn't have a policy. His policy was let people die and was worried about the stock market, and an absolute abysmal, incompetent president and his administration, except maybe Fauci. So I feel very good about that. I think in terms of universal health care, I'm, of course, for Medicare single payer. It's the only system around the world that really works to provide universal health care, no financial barriers. He does want to lower Medicare to 60, which I would love since I'm on the congressional health plan. And I only owe $40,000 in copays since I've been on it. It's just, corporate ripoff as our medical system is. I think he'll be strong there. I think he'll be strong in creating infrastructure jobs. I think he'll be very strong probably on criminal justice reform. I think Kamala Harris will push for that. However, as someone who's been a progressive activist inside the Democratic Party for 40 years and was one of the leaders in Congress on many things that were progressive, I learned that unless you push from outside the Democratic Party, the donor class of the Democratic Party will dominate, and so will the corporate wing of the Democratic Party and the centrists. Unless we unify, fight them, push them as hard as we can, The Democratic Party, Biden, Harris, you'll sort of see a maintenance of, some of the status quo, but some very progressive changes, I think, in COVID-19, and certainly healthcare and, the environment. However, where I'm not optimistic is even, I heard you talking about poor people. I was a poor person for many years because I grew up disabled without a father. But I still, managed to get through law school and work, but I work disabled, doing much better now. There needs to be a Marshall Plan of our inner cities. There needs to be a Jobs for All, like a Rooseveltian Jobs for All program. I've written that bill. It's a Jobs for All bill, HR 1000, introduced by Frederica Wilson. We're going to be pushing that. I'm leading an effort with several organizations to draft a bill that will end homelessness in this country. Our movement will be pushing for a safety net for every person in this country, so no one's evicted from their home, no utilities are cut off. This is a real problem. I am very disappointed in both Harris and Biden. I have not heard them one time articulate or promulgate the need for a Rooseveltian safety net, or the kind of safety nets they have in Europe. That'll be one of the highest priorities on our agenda. And in the first 100 days, we're going to see everybody covered with health insurance, and then we'll move to single payer. And then lastly, tuition-free college, universally available child care, preschool, very, very important. Upward mobility for Black and brown people has got to be a priority. Where I live in Charlotte, we're 50th in the nation in upward mobility for Black and brown people. There's no plan by the Democratic Party to do that. And I'll conclude by saying that the days of the status quo, of the sort of old order of having a permanent underclass, the wealthy barely being taxed, we're what's considered a low-tax nation. We're going to have to tax the very wealthy and corporations and close loopholes, distribute that wealth so we can have a thriving middle class and upper middle class. And the billionaire class and the zillionaire, millionaire class, they've got to pay their fair share of taxes, just like every other country does in industrialized.
Just so we're clear, though, Joe Biden said things aren't going to change. He told them. He said that. He says, hey, things aren't going to change all that much. Also, we can look at the Wall Street Journal where these guys are talking about austerity. I'm unclear. Joel, I'm unclear on what powers, what leverage the lefties, progressives, whatever you guys want to call yourselves, have to push Biden on this. Like, I just don't see it. You can't do it outside of the election, but you're going to somehow do it after he gets into the White House. What leverage?
Well, you're talking to someone who was disabled, who built a movement from scratch, organized, literally millions of people. No one thought we could do it. And we got the Affordable Care Act passed. Why? Because Mr. Conyers, may rest in peace, and the Congressional Black Caucus and the Progressive Caucus held a weekly meeting for 9 years, and we organized the largest, most successful universal health care movement in the history of our nation. And you know what I was told over and over again, even by Mr. Conyers sometimes, even from some of Martin King's people, they used to call me Joel Quixote. Nah. We organized, we pressured our members of Congress, we held town hall meetings. I co-wrote a movie called Sicko by Michael Moore, and we organized uninsured people all across the country, and we won a very important victory. And Obama's people even tried to take back the bill, but we pushed back hard. We got it passed. Second example, under the Bush administration, I led an effort with Dr. Paul Zeitz and African leaders to pass the most comprehensive, largest bill called PEPFAR, brought in Bono, U2 star Bono, and we did the impossible. Under the Bush administration, we passed PEPFAR, $15 billion a year to Africa and the Caribbean for global AIDS prescription drugs, antiretrovirals. I worked with Colin Powell. I met with the Bush administration officials on a regular basis. We held about 200 congressional briefings, and we got that passed. Under Ronald Reagan, when Ron Dellums led the effort for sanctions against the criminal apartheid nation of South Africa, democracy works if we participate in it, if we blog, if we text. You can't text and blog and Facebook a movement. A movement is a science. I've mastered, that science by learning from the best people, from the civil rights movement, labor movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the late, great John Conyers. And, democracy works if we participate in it. You can't blog your way through a movement. So it seems 100% positive that we will make radical progressive changes within the next 4 years. But we can't do that by sitting at home and watching Rachel Maddow. We have to participate and be engaged in our democracy.
I think that last part pretty much everybody can agree with. I think that observational democracy is not actually democracy. That's just entertainment at a certain point. But another side of this, I hear you guys disputing over this one kind of back and forth, and we've had this with other guests, where progressive folks who are voting for Biden. Jamarl will get into it with them. And it's an interesting argument, but I kind of wanted to try something different here. It seems like the argument to me is one side says the DNC needs to radically reshape itself, and that is the number one priority. You sort of criticize and pull apart the DNC until you get something resembling a real driven movement. The other side thinks that you can't do that during this election cycle. And that, it's a sort of existential pitched battle where you really can't afford to try to do that reform right now. That what you need to do is sort of bite your tongue, hold your tongue, and vote for the lesser of two evils. Make that choice. Does that seem fair? What am I missing out? Maybe I'm going to be insulting both sides, and that never works. But I'm trying to bring something together here. What am I missing out? What's on the other side of that conversation?
I wouldn't call it the lesser of two evils. I would call Trump evil. I wouldn't call Biden evil. I think, his vice presidential. We've never had a woman of color. She's half Jamaican, half East Indian, who ran on Medicare for all. I wouldn't call that the lesser of two evils. I think that often the progressive movement and the left, makes these broad paint strokes like, defund the police, which is not a smart strategy. You can radically reform the police, but you don't defund the police. I think it's real simple. The progressive movement, and I'll be honest with you, when I first got to Congress, there really was not what I call a progressive movement. There was an attempt by many of us to form a progressive movement, and we did that by forming the Progressive Democrats of America. I felt that the Green Party, I'm going to offend some Greens here, I thought the Green Party was going in the wrong direction. My brother, Ralph Nader, I thought he went in the wrong direction when he ran in Florida. But now we really do have a Black Lives Matter movement. We have an immigration reform movement. We have a universal health care movement. We have the Poor People's Campaign. But until the progressive movement unites under one flagship, no different than the African National Congress in South Africa or the Indian National Congress in India, I call it a boutique, fake movement. It's fake. And the reason why it's fake is because the person who is hungry and has no food, the single black mother with 3 children, whether or not their kids will come home and not be shot by the police or illegally stopped, they need to have a voice. How are they going to get that voice? There must be a united, progressive organization, some kind of a coalition that has electoral power, that has funding, that has staff. And until I see that, I'm not going to, stop organizing a united front, because our country is in the hands of some billionaires and millionaires and corporate Democrats. And, we need every person to live in dignity, to have a job. It's what Franklin Roosevelt talked about in his second Economic Bill of Rights speech.
Yeah,
but
hey, Joel, we're out of time. We got to pull out. Joel, thank you for joining us. For everybody listening, that was Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the expanded and approved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for the passage of the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. He is also co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, JAM, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. And we'll be back in a minute. Interesting conversation. I think we identified one of the fault lines in this election. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a minute with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I suppose I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get into the headlines in the news. The polls are finally open today. Nearly 100 million Americans have already cast a ballot in early voting. Among the early voters were President Trump and his Democratic opponent, Vice President Joe Biden, who both decided to forego the traditional Election Day photo op at the polls. You know, Shane, that's sad. That's unfortunate. We miss, there's some things that people do in elections to add levity to it. And the reason that they're adding levity is because they want people to realize that, look, even though we're fighting, we're still together. It's like it's a brotherly fight. We missed that, and somewhere along the way, we've lost that. When Newt Gingrich started getting into the well of Congress and just spewing hatred and everything else, it just seems that the division was set. And at some point, that needs to mend. Otherwise, that is going to get worse and worse and worse. And where that ends up, it's a breakdown of our republic. What do you think?
I mean, our republic is constantly breaking down. I don't think there's one crucial point. It's not like we hit an iceberg and suddenly the ship capsizes. It's like a long, slow decline, and we are living through that decline. That's happening today, baby. You know, it's just like a constant process that we're living through. But broadly, yeah, the point you're making holds. I'm not trying to be too disagreeable there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. Oh, no, I wasn't trying to make the point like all of a sudden it's all at once. No, I agree with you. It's a decline. Well, that's what I said, one step after the next. Think of, I mean, the way I think in my head, anyway, of most things, is that there's logic to it, not before there's matter, if that makes sense. I know that sounds strange, but the inner workings of a thing, it's kind of like gravity and, you know, like they said, space, or gravity tells matter where to go.
The inexorable laws, the inexorable laws that govern the contents of the system. I get the point you're making.
Right. But the same thing is true about thoughts. It's like, the thoughts, the concept of things tell us, human beings, matter, how to function in our world and society. President Trump on Monday attacked the Supreme Court on several occasions during his final full day of campaigning before Election Day, accusing it of putting, quote, our country in danger, unquote, with its Friday ruling, which would allow Pennsylvania to continue accepting absentee ballots over Election Day, at least for the time being. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, the fourth of 5 rallies across the 4 states, Mr. Trump told the crowd that justices had made a, quote, political, quote unquote, political decision that would lead to cheating by his opponent, former President of the United States, Joe Biden. His comments followed an angry tweet in which he charged that the court's decision would allow rampant and unchecked cheating and induce violence in the streets. Twitter quickly flagged the president's assertion as potentially false, saying that some or all of the content shared of the tweet is disputed and may be misleading. Joe Biden closed his presidential campaign in western Pennsylvania on Monday, concluding with a drive-in rally outside the football stadium in Pittsburgh. It was the second straight day that Mr. Joe Biden held a nighttime rally in his childhood home state, highlighting the critical role that Pennsylvania may play in determining the outcome of Tuesday's election. And it was a full circle moment for Biden, who gave his first speech of his presidential campaign in Union Hall in Pittsburgh. Voters in Colorado and Louisiana would decide on a ballot measure that promised to shape the future of abortion access in their respective states, both in the short and the long term. Those efforts represent what many experts say is the future of abortion rights in America, a state-by-state battle over the abortion procedure as the fate of Roe v. Wade becomes less certain under a conservative Supreme Court. In Colorado, voters on Tuesday would consider Proposition 115, a ballot measure that would prohibit abortion after 22 weeks of pregnancy. The proposal offers only one exception. If an abortion is immediately required to save the life of the pregnant woman when her life is physically threatened, according to the text of the proposition. The ban doesn't offer exceptions for victims of rape or incest or in situations of severe fetal abnormalities, conditions that typically aren't detectable until later in the pregnancy. In Louisiana, voters will consider a ballot measure that more than hypothetical, an amendment to the state constitution opposing abortion. Wow. If passed, the measure, Louisiana Amendment 1, the right for abortion, no right to abortion in the Constitution Amendment, would add one line to the state of Declaration of Rights. To human life, nothing in the Constitution should construe. Shane, I'm having a hard, for whatever reason, I can't talk this morning. To protect human life, nothing in the Constitution should be construed to secure or protect a right to abortion or require the funding of abortion. What do you think about this, Shane? I mean, this is basically the state, or, yeah, you could say the state, pushing back against something that the Supreme Court has pretty much settled, or at the very least, somewhat settled. It was settled anyway. Well, let's go to the next one. The next one is a little bit more interesting. The New York Police Department put known rioters on notice ahead of Election Day as the city braced for a possible riot protests over Tuesday's presidential contest. Quote, "Our intel has gotten a lot better. Our responses to getting cops out to the scene has gotten better," unquote. New York Police Department Chief Terrence Monahan said Monday about the protests that raged in New York over the summer. "We've identified those who are willing to cause damage and destruction, and we will be on them. We know who they are." Shane's right, that does sound menacing. Worldwide, there have been 46.9 million COVID cases, 31.4 million have recovered, and 1.21 million have died. The UK has recorded 1,038,000 coronavirus cases and 48,800 deaths, according to the data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. Reports are swirling that Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, and second in line to the throne, contracted COVID in April. Apparently, he was treated in the palace by doctors, isolated at home, and struggled breathing at one point. He remained active through his royal engagements at the time. His father, Prince Charles, also tested positive for coronavirus in the spring. In addition to the royals, Prime Minister Boris Johnson also battled COVID-19 in the spring. Johnson became the first world leader to announce that he had contracted COVID-19 in March. He was admitted to the hospital and then transferred to the ICU, but is now recovered. Well, this was the whole herd immunity stuff that we used to joke about, because Boris Johnson, initially the UK was thinking about the idea of herd immunity, which basically let the weak die off. That older population, those people who are sick, ill, etc., let them die off. He gets COVID, and then he comes back. He has a whole raft of policies and everything else where he's greatly sensitive to the needs of the public about COVID. It's amazing compared to here. It's not even a comparison. Gunmen stormed the campus of Kabul University in Afghanistan's capital on Monday morning, forcing thousands of students to flee in panic and leaving almost 20 people dead before security forces regained control. An unclear number of students were taken hostage by the assailant during the chaotic, hours-long siege, but officials said later that 3 attackers had been killed and the attack was over. That's astonishing. Shane, we used to have those things where kids were so engaged in our politics back during the Vietnam War and whatnot, where we've had situations where our kids were shot. Like, not me as an individual, you know what I'm talking about, like at schools and stuff like that. That's when kids were so engaged in politics. And they were engaged in a way that was infectious. It was bringing professors out there with them. I've heard lectures of professors talking about being out on the front lines with the students as cops hit, beat, pepper spray. And the professor was like, he was shocked by all of it. He was like, there's no way the cop would do that. And bam, the cop, it was that type of stuff. These days, less so. We don't seem to have that level of discourse and dialogue to push our conversations forward like we did back then.
If you want it, you just got to institute a draft. I think that's the thing. That's what made the difference back in Vietnam.
Well, right. Well, that was the interesting part. I mean, it's like, is that what it takes? I mean, there's nothing else other than dragging people into a military situation where you're forcing them, putting a gun in their hand, forcing them to fight, or putting them in a cage if they don't. Those are the only two options.
And those are the options. When we talk about, we've had this conversation, I think late last week we were having it. I forget which day. We were talking about civil unrest in different countries. You were talking about Peter Turchin and his theories on societal unrest and civil unrest and how these things grow in cycles. And one of the big indicators there is if you look around and you find a sort of up and coming, well-educated population that's suddenly losing out on on its economic prospects and or is facing some serious hardship. That's kind of what happened back in the late 60s. Not so much the economic side of it, but you had like a pretty well-educated class of folks coming up who were suddenly asked to go and fight overseas, and they really didn't want to do that. And then, of course, there's an ethical side to opposing war too. But frankly, what it comes down to is you just got to try to conscript people, and they're not going to like that, and then you're going to get a mass wave of political involvement.
Self-interest. If that's true, and if everything takes self-interest, then we're screwed. I mean, because I agree with you. Something about Vietnam was able to pull people in and get people jazzed up and everything else. But that doesn't seem to be here now. And it's like, well, wait, where is everyone? When the Iraq War was going, you had the Iraq War push back, and you had that take a while. Noam Chomsky talks about how long it took for that to grow and develop into a movement. But people seem dejected. They just seem like, I can't put my finger on it. And it's COVID to some level. But to another level, well, let's do this. Let's go to Snowden first. Former U.S. Security Counsel Edward Snowden said Monday that he and his wife intends to apply for Russian citizenship without renouncing their U.S. citizenship. Snowden, a former contractor with the United States National Security Agency, has been living in Russia since 2013 to escape prosecution in the United States after having leaked classified documents detailing government surveillance programs. He was granted permanent residency last month, his lawyers said. Snowden's wife, Lindsay Mills, an American who has been living with him in Russia, announced last week that the couple are expecting a child. According to Snowden's lawyer, Anthony Kirchena, the child, a boy, will be born in December and will have a Russian citizenship. Snowden will be able to get a Russian passport without renouncing his U.S. nationality after Russia earlier this year relaxed its strict citizenship laws. Previously, the law required foreigners to renounce their nationalities in order to get Russian citizenship. 5 people died, including the assailant, and 17 others were wounded in a shooting in the heart of Vienna hours before coronavirus lockdown started, Austrian authorities said Tuesday. The dead attacker was a 20-year-old Austrian-born Macedonian dual national who had a previous terror conviction, 2 men and 2 women died from their injuries in the attack on Monday evening, Chancellor Sebastian Kurz said. The suspected attacker was shot and killed by police. Vienna's hospital said 7 people were in life-threatening conditions Tuesday after the attack, the Austrian news agency APA reported. In total, 17 people were being treated in hospitals with gunshot wounds, but also cuts. Interior Minister Karl Nehammer later told APA that the dead assailant, who had roots in Balkan National and North Macedonia, had a previous conviction under the law that punishes membership in a terrorist organization. The attacker, named at Compt Festival, was sentenced to 22 months in prison in April 2019 because he tried to travel to Syria to join the Islamic State group. He gained early release in December under juvenile law. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's go into a break because I ran over a little bit. So you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Tells you more.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station out of Washington, D.C. Joining us today, though, one of our favorite guests, definitely one of our most informative, Chuck Zalakin. Chuck Zalakin is...
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I apologize, Chuck. I was looking for your... There we are. Is the Legislative and Political Director for New York Metro Area Postal Union, APWU. Welcome back. How's it going, man?
Okay, well, thanks for having me back. It's always nice to have the opportunity to, express what we're going through. I mean, it's a crazy time, that's for sure, particularly for postal workers. I've been speaking to a number of them. The lucky ones are only working 84 hours a week at this point. That's how intense the hours are for postal workers, trying to make sure these ballots get out in a timely fashion and now are postmarked. I mean, one thing, every state has different regulations. It's not like there's a national standard for these elections. So that's one aspect of the problem. But I would be remiss to say that all these problems stem back to the Postmaster General Louis DeJoy when he came in June 15th and instituted all of these delays and the changes in procedure. And even though the courts, and also I should say, there are 12 ongoing lawsuits against the DeJoy, USPS, and Trump over the mail delays in election mail. And part of what I'm doing is I'm monitoring what's taking place in these lawsuits. I mean, yesterday there were judges making rulings impacting on this case because the Postal Service and I guess the government lawyers have been fighting these things from the beginning. So, I mean, for me, the two things: one, people can focus on delaying the ballots because of DeJoy's connection to Trump. I mean, I don't know how he proved that motivation other than their connections. But one thing that is for sure, that DeJoy came in, and part of his goal was to institute a privatization of the Postal Service. And you just can't privatize a government agency that has a 91% approval rating. And by what's going on now in terms of people's minds and whatever's their attitude of the Postal Service because of the election, I don't think the Postal Service would rate at 91%. So DeJoy's been successful.
Well, you say, he's been successful in destroying it in that sense. I mean, I think your point is
right.
He's trying to undermine the Postal Service so people can lose faith in it, and people will go to other private entities and those type of things.
Right.
Let me ask you, is DeJoy's influence having, meaning the things that are going down, the post office is normally busy on election day under normal circumstances. This year makes it just insane on top of it just because of COVID and the absentee ballots and everything else. Has his impact been felt? Meaning, on this day and trying to get the things back on the correct day and the proper day so they can be counted. Has the impact of DeJoy been felt?
Well, of course it's been felt, but understand it's not just ballots, it's also election mail. All the candidates putting the mailings out. I mean, the post office has to deliver that in a timely fashion. And that goes back, quite some time. So it's not just, election day, it's the whole election season. But this isn't something that just appears, out of the sky. Everybody knows that. So when he was appointed and took over in June 15th and knew in May that he was going to get the job, he knew then that there was COVID, that there were going to be more people using mail-in ballots because of COVID. And as opposed to coming in and saying, okay, I've got to deal with staffing and make sure the sorting machines are there and that we're totally committed to doing everything we can, he just came in and started making changes to initially slow the mail down in June. And it took court orders to get him to put back some of what was being done and to change it. He didn't do it overnight. They fought it all the way. And I monitor these court cases every day. They were in court yesterday because the judges put in that there had to be monitoring and daily reports of what was going on with the mail, but also they had to make extraordinary measures. So there was a discussion in court yesterday about these ballots that are being, or mail and ballots that's being recorded that they're going into plants, but there's no recording that they're going out. And that's when the Postal Service said, well, we made extraordinary measures, so we're not delivering the ballots to local post offices to deliver to the election centers. We're delivering them directly there, so we're not scanning them out. I mean, you could just get lost in the morass of all of this stuff. But I know postal workers are working as hard as they can. I mean, we're talking working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week at this point, and some of them are even working longer than that in an atmosphere where the concern about the uptick in COVID is taking place. So it's under extraordinary stress. But again, it's not like DeJoy came in, assessed the situation, and said, oh, I have to up the employees or even have more management people in there. He was trying to cut from the beginning. So, I mean, what he has done has been responsible for what's taken place in a COVID environment, increase in the ballots, and people are working as hard as they can to get out everything. And then, of course, now the court ruling of them having to be, postmarked. In some areas, they weren't postmarked because if they use business reply mail, that traditionally wasn't postmarked. So the extraordinary efforts being made to get these ballots out in a timely fashion, and
Chuck,
at least have
quick question.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
I'm curious. If Joe Biden wins, are you and will the post office or some entity that represents the post service attack the Democratic Party to get them to ensure the funding that the post office needs, but also to get rid of the joy?
Well, again, the joy was put in by the
Board of Governors, but the Board of Governors can do it. And if the president is pressuring these guys, or maybe the president has no power over it at all.
There are 4 vacancies in the Postal Board of Governors, and it's supposed to be Republicans and Democrats. They're Democrats. So again, it's a question of, who's if Biden gets in, who his appointees are going to be. But we understand that the lack of funding for the post office has been bipartisan. The fact is that no one said, when the CARES Act went through, we need to make up the loss in funding the Postal Service is dealing with, because it's an election year. We got to make sure they're funded fully. Both Democrats and Republicans had their own issues. They weren't really concerned about what was best for the American people, and therefore funding the Postal Service. So we have to keep the pressure on. I've been around long enough. It's not like, the Democrats we're okay. No way. We have to be after them, both parties, because they're both influenced by forces that want to privatize and not make the post office what it should be. So Biden.
That actually brings us back today. Okay. Chuck, thank you again for being with us. A quick question. Today's, as you probably know, today's the election day.
Yes.
How do you think, a couple different angles we could come in on this one, but I'll just start with this one. How do you think the USPS delays that you're talking about, the Postal Service delays, the extraordinary measures that you mentioned, all of these changes, including the defunding and just radical reshaping of things by Louis DeJoy, how do you think, from an insider's view, how is that going to affect today's election, and what happens in the next week or two, assuming it's not decided tonight? How do you think that's going to play into it, Chuck?
Well, I think the Postal Service and the workers are making an extraordinary effort to get the ballots postmarked and out in a timely fashion. I think what is provided is an excuse for those who want to, challenge the election. I don't really think, in effect, that it's will end up having a negative impact. It'll just be providing an excuse for people who may want to challenge the outcome of the election. But, from what I've seen, they're going through plant stations or whatever, scouring to make sure that every ballot is out, and they're using extraordinary measures to get them out. So in terms of reality, I think the work has been done despite the joy, despite COVID, despite the lack of funding. But for those who want to have, you can deliver millions of ballots, and if someone finds 50 somewhere out there, that becomes the news story. So again,
the Postal Service, from what you're saying, is doing its job, but it might be used, the wider potential crisis might be used as a pretext for questioning the results of the election.
That was the whole intent, that from DeJoy coming in, was to provide that excuse, and also to damage the Postal Service, because what takes place after November 4th. But from my experience of being in the Postal Service since 1978, I've never seen any evidence of any kind of intentional disruption or any kind of aspect of corruption, or whatever you want to say. All of this can be attributed to this Postmaster General. It's a shame that Brennan left, because she was committed to the Postal Service, the people, and DeJoy is committed to his president buddy, but more so to privatizing the Postal Service. And that's the number one goal. And that really is at war with the American people, who 91% approved of the Postal Service. And the idea was they couldn't privatize with that high rating, so they had to get into people's mind. People would wait on 3 hours online.
That's to sully their reputation. Chuck, we're out of time here.
Okay.
I get where you're going completely. Chuck, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you.
For those listening, that was Chuck Zlatkin, Legislative and Political Director for the New York Metro Area Postal Union. That's APWU. We'll be back in a minute talking with Mark Frost. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our guest for this segment and the next, Mark Frost. He's an economist, a professor, a consultant, a drummer, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. Those last two clauses there, those last two phrases, rhyme with each other. So it's a nice, pithy bio with a rhyming outro. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm actually doing quite well. It's nice and crisp in Georgia, and I'm glad for this election season to be ending. I can't take it anymore.
It's driving all of us, I think, up the wall, which reminds me of the most important question. Speaking of being driven up the wall, how is the most important pressing question we could be asking you this morning? How's your cat Gauss doing? He's all things considering, he's doing okay. He gets force fed. So I'm not a very good libertarian. In fact, every time I take him to the vet to get force fed, he looks at me and he goes, "You're not a real libertarian," basically. To make a long story short, I probably have a few more months with him. So, yeah, it's a hard one because I've had him 20 years and he's been through, he's half of my adult life and my longest non-genetic relationship. That is a lot. No, that's a lot, man. That's intense. Yeah, that's a tricky thing. I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I've lived through it with relatives of mine, parents and aunts and such who had pets, who had animal companions, however you want to, whatever term you want to use. And they get older, and then you get these serious debilitating problems, and it's always that conflict and that moral conflict, and then you're left with the choice. How am I going to remember them? How am I going to not just live through these last days, but what's the perspective that I'm going to have on this? Anyway, that's above my head at this point, and I think above my pay grade too. Mark, thank you for being with us. We're talking about the election. We could be talking about a bunch of different sides of this. I know who you're voting for. You said it a couple of times on the air. I'm guessing your ballot's cast.
Yes, it is.
We could be talking about a couple different things here. I'll start with this actually. The employees who gave most to Trump and Biden. So there's a breakdown over on Bloomberg of the different employees and the different sort of sectors of work in terms of, occupations that people have and where people are voting. And the one thing that I will note, just looking at this, is how there are these two different charts, like bubble charts or bubble graphs, representing each sector. So whether it's an occupation and you're looking at a sector, or whether you're looking at different employers, which employers hire people and where they go, they're very blue. They're very top heavy and blue, where there are far more people in these, specifically in universities and in companies, far more people donating to Biden than donating to Trump, which is just interesting. Anyway, I'm sure you saw this. What do you think for real quick, I guess, one quick question. This doesn't mean that Biden necessarily received that much more money, does it? Or does it just mean, I don't think this is a dollar basis. I think this is a numerical employee count basis, but maybe I'm getting it wrong. And what do you think this means? What should we read from this, Mark?
Yeah, I don't believe the article looked at total contributions. It looked at relative percentages and who's giving what to who. What I found fascinating about it, and I have a love-hate relationship with Bloomberg. I'll just admit with you. I'll gladly admit it. But what I found fascinating, I knew that, being an academic as well, I knew that academia always leans Democrat. Always, always, always. I mean, if you just do a survey of most academics, or of all academics, most academics, the vast majority of academics will much more identify with the Democratic Party historically than they have the Republican Party. So that didn't shock me. What I found fascinating was the one mostly at the bottom. I kind of figured that Twitter and universities and government would be in the Democratic, end of things. What I found fascinating was the occupations, writers and authors, social workers. That sort of makes sense. They get their money from government. Scientists, consultants. I spend a lot of time with consultants, and I have a pretty poor opinion of them. Getting back to being a Schumpeterian, Schumpeter argued that capitalism is doomed, not because what Marx said, that it failed to provision the proletariat, but rather it provisions the proletariat so well. People have so much leisure that they can become intellectuals and make a living out of it. People like Shane and Jamal, people like me, people who are hypercritical of the system, but don't actually produce any cupcakes or donuts, so to speak. That's what Schumpeter worried about. And so one would expect, from a Schumpeterian perspective, those sorts of things. But the really interesting thing to me was the red, pastors, firefighters, manufacturing, technicians, electricians, truckers, what we call the manual professions, electricians, things like that. It's just utterly fascinating to me because a lot of these things I would have thought would have been different. Financial advisors and consultants, I would have thought that would be more Republican, but it's just interesting. And the really interesting thing about it is this is good data. This is how people have actually donated. And I think the article said something like it represents 57% of all contributions made to the candidates. So it's a really good proxy of how the public, on average, is revealing their preferences this election.
Mark, I'm not thrilled necessarily about this election. I mean, it's a very strange feeling.
I'm not either, dude.
I'm excited in one sense because it's politics, and that's what I do. And so it's just kind of like, oh yes, there's an election today. But it's also like, there's an election today. And I think about Biden, who seems to just be sleepwalking his way into the White House. And I have to think about Trump, who what I would consider let all of those people die or just screwed up in this particular administration. What do you think a Biden administration is? And that backs this question, because it wasn't like Biden was running saying, I'm going to deal with healthcare. It wasn't even after the COVID stuff hit. And you had all of these people dying and everything else. Biden didn't come out and was like, we're going to pass Medicare for all, and we're going to deal with these health. He didn't do that. He was still in his basement. So I have no idea what a Biden administration looks like. Do you?
You know what? I'm going to be honest with you. I would like to sit up here and talk and sound smart and tell you give you my prediction, but I'm with you. I don't really know because I don't know. Because presidents, we've even seen this with Trump. Presidents in and of themselves are constrained by the fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy and that sort of a thing. I don't really know exactly what Joe Biden will do. What I do know is what I have disliked about a lot of Democrats. Indeed, the reason I voted for Obama, it had nothing to do with race, because I'm not going to vote for somebody because of their race. It had to do, I was so sick of George Bush, and I was so ashamed as an American that we were tearing up the world in a overreaction to 9/11. And there was some argument for Afghanistan, but Iraq just nuked me. And so when Tulsi came around, that was my candidate. That's who I wanted to vote for. I don't even like Trump. I voted for him, but I voted against Biden. And your question is very profound because you're asking me, basically what you're asking me is, Mark, why did you vote for Trump? And my answer actually is, well, I don't want Biden. I don't really like Trump, but the fears I had about Trump, say 2 years ago, if you went on my Twitter feed and saw what I had to say about Trump 2 years ago, you'd think, oh, this guy's a staunch Democrat. And so I think that's an interesting point to make there because I used to take Trump literally. Now I don't take him literally at all. And I just look at what there's enough data in history now that I know what a second Trump presidency is probably going to look like. And I'm going to just say it. Trump at least delivered what I wanted from Tulsi. No stupid, unnecessary wars. He still lets the hawks get him into things. He almost launched an attack on Iran and he came to his senses. But I can't speak for every American, but I, as an economist, am sick of this constant waste of resources. It seems like we always have money for war, but we don't have money to teach people how to read. We always have money to go bomb somebody, but we don't have money to put air conditioning in a school. Our priorities as a society have been warped. And I used to think it was just Democrat, Republican ideology, and it's really not. Trump has done things I hate. He's done things I can't stand, but he has done one thing nobody can take away from him. For better or worse, he's transformed the Republican Party. It's not the Republican Party that it once was. I was curious and went to the Trump rally in Georgia. I wanted to see what kind of people show up. And I was shocked. It wasn't I had some bias. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be.
What did you think and what was it?
Aspects that I thought it was going to be a bunch of rednecks, Georgia rednecks, exclusively white, kind of the classic stereotypical Hollywood central casting Georgians. And it wasn't. There was black, brown, Hispanic, Asian people. There was gay people. It was somehow Trump's Republican Party has become, you guys are the journalists, the right word for it. They've become nicer than some people on the left. I really first noticed it when I was supporting Tulsi. I expected to go fight Republicans like I had been fighting on Twitter for years over Tulsi, and it turned out I had to fight Democrats. And it kind of changed me a little bit. It made me step back and stop being just an economist and start saying, okay, politics matter too. What's actually going on in people's heads here? And what are people worried about? And
is that part of why you are no longer, a capital L libertarian? Is that part of why you are now a recovering libertarian? Is sort of seeing some of the benefits of politics, Mark?
No, because I was never. I think we've had this discussion, but there's really two big categories of libertarianism. There's the anarcho-capitalists, who ironically they don't like Antifa. They want them dead, but they want them to destroy society and break down the government infrastructure first, so they can have their anarchistic heaven, so to speak. Because to an anarcho-capitalist, an individual is sovereign, and they can opt in and opt out of a government anytime that they want to. Government should be perfectly voluntary, that sort of a thing. So I was never one of those. I've never been somebody that said taxation was theft. I've never been somebody that said that government was a necessary evil. I've always thought government is a necessary good. Ludwig von Mises believe that you can't have a decent society without a functioning government. You need property rights. You need to set the basic rules of the game, and it has to be something that is sustainable. And too many libertarians have an ideal that are in search of a reality that just doesn't make sense. There are some things the market won't do well because the price signals are either warped, or there's externalities, or it's a public good, or the market either won't produce it in the optimal quantity, et cetera, et cetera. And I would rather be living under a communist society or a fascist society than true anarchy. It's the worst possible system, if you even call it a system. It's the worst possible ism that I think a person can have. Well, libertarians have a civil war this election, just like the Democrats have had
take a break. We're at we're at our break point. We'll be back, and we're going to let you finish though. This is economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, shoot-utinarian, and recovering libertarian, Mark Frost. One of my favorite guests, actually. Well, we'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. Joining us is Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, shoot-utinarian, and recovering libertarian. Once again, thank you for joining us, Mark. Let me ask you this.
Glad to be here.
If, assuming one of these guys clearly is going to win, they're going to have to put together, pick up the pieces of a country that in many respects is in tatters, whether it's the number of people who have lost their jobs, the number of people who are thrown out of their homes. And that's assuming that the government even cares. If it's a Biden administration, at the very least, there will be some idea or some notion that the social contract should exist. So I guess what I'm saying, what needs to happen once, let's say Biden gets in, or Trump gets in, because I think the moment that one of them gets in, I think the other party is going to give them the money for the stimulus. But basically, if you were the economist talking to these guys in the next administration, what needs to happen going forward to bring the country, basically pull the country out of the hippopotamus, out of the dish, out of the marsh?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, we need to open up the economy. If there's one single issue that pushed my vote for Trump, my algorithm for voting was, I'm going to vote for the candidate that has the least probability of embracing shutdowns ever again for any reason. They don't work. There's no science behind them. And over time, they're a mortgage on our children's future over time. You can't start spending $3 trillion a quarter for something that is bad. It kills people. It's certainly real. It's serious. And it needs to be taken serious.
Wait, what do you mean
there's
no science behind it, Mark?
Shutting the economy down.
Mark, there is science behind it. From the standpoint of the distancing.
No, there isn't science behind it, and I challenge you to go find that. Find me a scientific paper, not a journalistic piece, but find me a paper that goes and looks at a COVID-style virus and shows that shutdowns work.
Oh,
I mean,
said,
there's so
it
much
depends on how we.
literature out there.
Okay. It depends on how we frame it and what shutdowns mean and those type of things. I guess I'm getting more so into the science of separation and distancing, like this notion that if.
Well, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about social distancing. I'm talking about using the authority of the police state of government to prevent human beings from engaging in what I argue their natural right to truck, barter, and exchange. That's a shutdown. It's telling people they can't assemble during Thanksgiving. It's telling people what they have to do in the privacy of their own home. I was an early advocate of gay marriage because I don't think the government, for any reason, has the right to be involved in that type of stuff.
But Mark,
that's my value.
There are going to be things that propagate in your society where government is going to come in, and it's a rational thing to say, hey, we need to stop the propagation of it. I mean, for God's sake, it's raging in the overwhelming majority of the country. I mean, it's not that I'm
also, Mark, I think
shutdown.
That's the point that I'm making. There's a lot of people, especially on Twitter, that talk how much they love science, and they don't love science. They don't even know what it is. Biden says it all the time. He goes, I'll trust this science. He puts a "the" before it every time. There is no such thing as the science. I'm a scientist myself. I detect fraud for a living, basically. That I have to go through and decide what's the probability that this is fraud. And guess what? I'm not always right. Other scientists that do this, sometimes they're more right than me. Sometimes they're more wrong. So science is a body of knowledge, and you take it in the entirety of its structure.
It's a tool.
And you might have. I'm sorry.
And it's a mindset.
It's
a mental process.
Yeah.
There are different ways of looking at this. You can have the science of Francis Bacon. You can have the sort of birth of the empirical sciences, or you could have the scholastic school, which kind of resembles modern academe. And science as this built-up body of not just beliefs, not just knowledge, but all the specific scientists. Anyway, this is getting a little bit confusing. There are these different views of it, but right. I think we fundamentally agree here that science at its heart is not a sort of set body of knowledge, but it's something that's growing, that's changing. As specific scientists use better and worse tools and techniques to try to improve it in different ways.
We talk about it all the time, Shane. Like with COVID,
going through paradigm shifts and stuff.
Learning about the processes that goes along, that type of stuff. Yeah, I make that point all the time.
It's not what science isn't, and I think what Mark is pushing back on here is science is not a sort of backstop for your beliefs, where when push comes to shove, you say you're right because of the science, quote unquote. I think what he's saying is,
like some people say, I believe in God. For example, I had a friend of mine, and she said, well, it's not that it's not that I'm against gays, God's against it. And it's like, don't use God as a dodge. If you don't like it, you don't like, you know what I mean? Like if you're going to be a bigot, be a bigot.
What you've said on the show in the past, and I'm pretty sure where you're standing now, is that if we had a virus that was similar to this one, but with a much higher mortality rate, let's just put this number out there, like a 90% mortality rate. You don't do anything about it. Even if you treat people with it, 90% of the people who catch it die. If it's that catastrophic, then lockdowns, measures that heavy are warranted, that kind of thing. But I think what you're saying, from what you've said in the past, is in the cost-benefit ratio of making different choices as a society, we might be doing ourselves more disservice by implementing these lockdowns than benefit by implementing them. Is that broadly your take, Mark?
Yes. My position as thinking scientifically on this is that there is an optimal quantity of COVID-19 death, and it is not zero. That's fundamentally, that's the economic science behind it. If you have an oil spill in the ocean, you don't clean up every drop.
I mean, you're being, this is just honest, right? The greatest person on the planet will have deaths associated with this virus. So yeah, I agree with you, Mark. Yeah.
Yes. So the question is, now here's where science has to end. What's the optimal quantity of death? A scientist, an economist cannot tell you that. I can look up and say, okay, the value of a human life statistically, relatively to the entire economy, is X. But the public has to decide what quantity of death they're comfortable with. It's the same way with roads. speed limits. We could virtually save 50,000 people a year by having very restrictive speed limits, say 1 mile an hour on the highways. But the public would revolt. They would say, we're fine with taking the risk of dying and having all these more deaths and 4.5 million injuries per year because we value so much our mobility. This is where we lose it in our society. Scientists can't tell us what the proper abatement is. That requires morality. It requires a value judgment that one person, unless they're a king, cannot decide. We have to decide it as a society. And I
what
think
you're saying is that the scientists, the
March,
economists, they can give models. They can provide models to help people with more or less accuracy determine what's going to happen if you make certain choices. But they can't break that is-ought dichotomy. They can't switch from giving you a model that can describe what reality is going to look like if you make decision X versus decision Y. They can't go from that to you should make decision X or you should make decision Y. That's the role of politics. That's the role of the public. That might be, you brought up the idea of a king or just the idea of a leader. Is that kind of where you were going with that, Mark?
Yeah, sort of. Going back to Schumpeter, he has a famous quote, and it goes, see if I can cite it from memory. Society can, if they absolutely insist, ascribe value to the irrational. And all we scientists are ever permitted to say about it is it will, in fact, cost something. So I think going to war with Iraq was insane. I thought it was so irrational. We got nothing from it, and it cost us and our friends and the world a whole lot. But the hawks who were abating terrorism, they so over-abated that we gave up some of our liberties to go fight terrorists. I mean, I'll tell you right now, I prefer the America pre-9/11 to the America post-9/11. It was a better America. In my view, Osama bin Laden won the ideological battle because we sacrificed our core cherished values in the name of fighting terrorism. So that's the entire concept behind abatement analysis. You don't over-abate so that the marginal cost of that extra unit of abatement exceeds the value of the abatement. When the cost starts exceeding the benefit, you stop doing it. That's the optimal solution. And society has to decide how many deaths are permissible. So for instance, if you added to the election a vote line that said how many deaths have to be abated before we would shut down the economy, I doubt even one person would say shut down the economy if it saves one person. If it saves 20 million, I bet most Americans would say shut down the economy. So somewhere between one person and 20 million is the societal preference. And that's where democracy comes in my view. And it's something we miss as a society. The purpose of democracy is to provide our governance with the morality by which we are to be governed. That's why I like Tulsi. It's why I didn't like George Bush. It's why I voted for Obama. It's why I voted for Gary Johnson last election, because I want to have less irrational choices by our government. Going back to Jamal's question earlier, what kind of Biden administration would it look like? I don't know, but I'll tell you what my fear is. It would look like what I was pretty convinced a Hillary administration would look like. Hawkish.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, as much as I'd like things about the Obama administration, they ruined the Middle East. I mean, I can't believe what they did to the Middle East.
Honestly, Mark, I can't agree with you more. When you really think about it, a human being made the choice to go into somewhere and just set it on fire. And they're out there selling slaves right now, talking about economics. This is Obama, Clinton. I mean, this is the type of mentality, and these people are going back in office if they win. Mark, I appreciate you coming on, man. Thank you for coming on. This is Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, shoot-a-tenarian, and recovering libertarian. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to have headlines coming back up in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show in news and politics. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We have a bunch of headlines, and so I'm just gonna race through those this morning. And by the way, we do headlines 3 times each morning, once at 7 and once at 8 and once at 9 a.m. Eastern. So you should, just know that. Just if you want to hear the headlines, you can hear at those times. Anyway, it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek weird statement there. Moving into the news, the polls are finally open. Nearly 100 million Americans have already cast a ballot in early voting today. Among the early voters were President Trump and his Democratic opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden, who both decided to forego the traditional Election Day photo op at the polls in favor of voting by mail. President Trump on Monday attacked the Supreme Court on several occasions during his full day of campaigning before Election Day, accusing the Supreme Court of, quote, putting our country in danger, end quote, with its Friday ruling, which would allow Pennsylvania to continue accepting absentee ballots after Election Day, at least for the time being. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, at the 4th of 5 rallies across 4 states, Mr. Trump told a crowd that the justices had made a political decision that would lead to cheating by his opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden. His comments followed an angry tweet in which he charged that the court's decision would allow rampant and unchecked cheating and, quote, induce violence in the streets, end quote. Twitter quickly flagged that tweet as potentially false, saying that, quote, some or all of the content shared in this tweet is disputed and might be misleading, end quote. Joe Biden, meanwhile, closed his presidential campaign in Western Pennsylvania on Monday, concluding with a drive-in rally outside a football stadium in Pittsburgh. It was the second straight day that Mr. Biden held a nighttime rally in his childhood home state, highlighting the critical role that Pennsylvania may play in determining the outcome of today's election. And it was a full circle moment for Biden, who gave the first speech of his presidential campaign at a Union Hall in Pittsburgh. So, speaking again on Pittsburgh for his last speech after his first speech of this cycle was also in Pittsburgh. Anywho, voters in Colorado and Louisiana will decide on ballot measures that promise to shape the future of abortion access in their respective states, both in the short and long term. Those efforts represent what many experts say is the future of abortion rights in America, a state-by-state battle instead of a federal battle over the procedure as the fate of Roe v. Wade becomes less certain under a conservative Supreme Court. In Colorado, voters on Tuesday will consider Prop 115, a ballot measure that would prohibit abortion after 22 weeks of pregnancy. The proposal offers only one exception: if an abortion is, quote, immediately required to save the life of the pregnant woman when her life is physically threatened, end quote. That's according to the text of the proposition. That ban doesn't offer exceptions for victims of rape or incest or in situations of severe fetal abnormalities, conditions that typically are not detectable until later on in a pregnancy. In Louisiana, voters will consider a ballot measure that's more hypothetical. That would be an amendment of the state's constitution opposing abortion. If passed, that measure titled the No Right to Abortion in Constitution Amendment, or Louisiana Amendment 1, that measure would add one line to the state's Declaration of Rights, and I'll read that line here. To protect human life, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to secure or protect a right to abortion or require the funding of abortion, end quote. Meanwhile, in New York City, the New York City Police Department put known rioters on notice ahead of Election Day as the city braced for possible protests over Tuesday's presidential contest. I'm going to quote here from the New York Chief of Police, Terrence Monahan. quote, our intel has gotten a lot better. Our responses to getting cops out to the scene has gotten a lot better. We've identified those who are willing to cause damage and destruction, and we will be on them. We know who they are, end quote. And again, where my mind goes with this one is it's like a big city. You got a lot of people there. Sure, you have a substantially smaller number of people regularly attending these protests, but that's still a lot of people you'd have to keep track of. I can't help but wonder, like, what tools, what surveillance tools specifically they're using to do this stuff. I think we've talked about this on the air in the past. Clearview AI, this company that works with federal law enforcement agencies, just law enforcement agencies in general too. It also works with private companies, basically doing facial recognition. So, you take a photo, you take a video, for instance, at one of these protests, and then you can run that photo or video through their tool, and they'll do searches on social media and give you the identity of the person. So I can't help but wonder if that's the kind of thing they're using here, which, if that's what they're doing, you should know about it. It's pretty crappy and scary from a civil liberties perspective. Anyway, that's my brief aside in the headlines. Moving on to the next one. Worldwide, there have been 46.9 million COVID cases, 31.4 million have recovered, and 1.21 million people have died from this disease globally. The UK has recorded over 1 million coronavirus cases and 46,800 deaths. That's according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. And reports are swirling in the air, hopefully not alongside the coronavirus itself, that Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge and second in line to the throne, contracted COVID in April. Apparently, he was treated by palace doctors and isolated at home and struggled breathing at one point. He remained active through his royal engagements at that time. His father, Prince Charles, also tested positive for coronavirus in the spring. And in addition to the royal family, Prime Minister Boris Johnson also battled the virus in the spring. Johnson became the first world leader to announce he had contracted COVID-19 in March. He was admitted to the hospital, then transferred to the ICU in April, but he is now recovered. And apparently a bit thinner, as we've reported in the past, where he said that his big thing, the reason he suffered the worst effects of COVID-19 was that he was a bit overweight. I think he had a sort of Boris Johnson-like tell-all interview where he talked about that. Anyway, in Afghanistan, gunmen stormed the campus of Kabul University in Afghanistan's capital on Monday morning. That forced thousands of students to flee in a panic, and it left almost 20 people dead. This was before security forces regained control. An unclear number of students were taken hostage by the assailants during the chaotic, hours-long siege. Officials, however, said later that 3 attackers had been killed and that the attack was over. Next story here. Former U.S. security contractor Edward Snowden said Monday that he and his wife intend to apply for Russian citizenship without renouncing their U.S. citizenship. Snowden, a former contractor with the U.S. National Security Agency, that's the NSA for you familiar folks, has been living in Russia since 2013 to escape prosecution in the U.S. This is after he leaked classified documents detailing government surveillance programs. He has been granted permanent residency in Russia last month. His wife, Lindsay Mills, an American who has been living with him in Russia, announced last week that the couple are expecting a child. And according to Snowden's lawyer, the child, a boy, will be born in December and will have Russian citizenship himself. This, by the way, follows the Russian government's decision earlier this year to relax its strict citizenship laws. Previously, the law required foreigners to renounce other nationalities in order to get Russian citizenship, but now they don't have to. You can have dual citizenship. In Vienna, 5 people are dead, including an assailant, and 17 others are wounded after a shooting in the heart of Vienna hours before a coronavirus lockdown started. The dead attacker was a 20-year-old Austrian North Macedonian dual national who had a previous terror conviction. 2 men and 2 women died from their injuries in the attack Monday evening. The suspected attacker was again shot and killed by police. Vienna's hospital service said that 7 people were in life-threatening condition after the attack, and that in total, 17 people were being treated in hospitals with gunshot wounds, but also cuts. Interior Minister Karl Nehammer later said that the dead assailant, who had roots in the Balkan nation of North Macedonia, had a previous conviction under a law that punishes membership in terrorist organizations. The attacker was sentenced to 22 months in prison in April 2019 because he had traveled to Syria to join the Islamic State group. He was, however, granted early release in December under juvenile law. In Nigeria, a prominent End SARS protester, that's Anthony Unyode, was murdered during a demonstration. The protests were held under the End SARS banner, a reference to demands for the disbandment of the notorious special anti-robbery squad that, again, is SARS, not, to be clear, the Southeast Asian Respiratory Syndrome, but again, the special anti-robbery squad. Officers have repeatedly been accused of criminal activity ranging from extortion to extrajudicial killings. Ngode, the man who was murdered, has been very active in those protests. And again, during a march, it's unclear exactly how this happened, but he suffered deep machete wounds to his head and died, as you would expect if you suffered deep machete wounds to your head. Last headline here: dangerous and powerful Hurricane Eta churned toward Nicaragua's Caribbean coast with potentially devastating winds early this morning, while heavy rains from its outer bands were already causing rivers to overflow across Central America. The Category 4 hurricane had sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, and the U.S. National Hurricane Center in Miami warned that Eta could strengthen further, perhaps reaching a catastrophic Category 5 before making landfall Tuesday. The government said that more than 3,000 families were taken to shelters from the most at-risk areas. And with that, those were our headlines. You were listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And look at that, Jamarl. Man, those are a good chunk of headlines to go through. We are on the other side of them, free and clear, as if we've just passed the outer periphery of Hurricane Eta, and we are now once again free to return to our normal topics of choice.
Yeah,
please take it away for a second, man.
Yeah, you pulled it through him. You did a good job. You got him. Good job. I mean, the thing is, you go to 1,000 headlines. I mean, because there's always news. Like, there's always something that's going on that's enrapturing people. But, of course, today, the thing is the election. There's a thing, it was funny. Crystal Ball had a comment where she made the point that says, what's the best case scenario if Trump wins? And lefties, I know some lefties have this idea that the Democratic Party will somehow come to their senses if Trump wins. My mom said that. My mom, in 2016, she said, well, Hillary lost. The Democrats have to learn. They have to do something. Got to come to their senses. And I said, you voted for her. She was like, yep. Oh, right. Here's the thing. Going forward for any particular election, you get my vote when you represent my interests. That should be the motto of the voter. In fact, not just the motto of the voter. It should dig so far into the voter. You get my vote when you represent my interests. That the inversion of politics that takes place in our world should be utterly and entirely offensive. And it is. You have a situation where Biden just seems to be standing there with these shades on. And it's like, hey, Biden, people need health care. Go vote for the other guy. It's a scam to some degree. These guys, let me just say it this way. If you're a lefty, my objective in going after people is not to get them to vote Trump. That's not what I was pushing for. In any of these cases, it was never to get the people to vote Trump. I never even made the point to say people should vote Trump. What my point is, regardless of who is on the other side, you should hold your person accountable. You get my vote when you represent my interests. It should be that straightforward, that dogmatic. And because understand the difference. In your system, Joe Biden just stands there and people throw themselves at Joe Biden because they're terrified of Trump. And what happens? You get worse and worse outcomes. Meaning you have a situation where you have like a FDR at one point. Then you have a Bill Clinton at one point. Then you have these guys go further and further and further and further to the right. If you're looking for a way out, if they're looking at you saying you have no place to go and all this other nonsense, you do have somewhere to go. You always have somewhere to go. The fight and the leverage in the political space is not always entirely done in the political space. Sometimes that fight is waged outside the space with leverage. Meaning, if 30 million people came to attention and say, we demand health care. You get our vote when you represent our interests. We demand health care. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Fine. Here's our demand. We're in the midst of a pandemic. 220,000 people are dead. Why do I have to push? Why do I have to even make this argument? And is the Democratic Party willing to tank it to a man they call the apocalypse and the end of all things, as opposed to appropriating a policy that the overwhelming majority of the public supports, that the youth support. So we're bringing them to your cause. And numbers drawn, just running out of the woodwork, out of the house. Is that enough? Meaning, is the Democratic Party willing to lose it to a man they call the apocalypse, as opposed to appropriating a policy that is morally right, ethically right, considering where we are, philosophically right, considering it's their job? Or are they going to take it? Fact of the matter is, the very demand itself, the very fact that the public comes together and sets the precedent of creating a demand, in and of itself could be the thing that they rebel against. The party could say, I'm not going to accept your demand, but think about what that means. It's one thing if you say, are you really going to tank it for the apocalypse? This is another thing for the party to actually do it. And then you have to get into questions of what does it mean if you're representative government? What does it mean from the standpoint of party? All those things go up into question the moment they do that. But I'm making the point that it is for the public to set a demand. And in this space, the public was too terrified to do so. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and our guest, Jim Jotras. Jim is a Washington, D.C. based government and media relations specialist. He is also an attorney licensed in D.C. and Pennsylvania who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. And by the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Jim Jotras. That is Jotras spelled Jatras. Jim, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
Well, I'm not sure yet. I'll find out later tonight, I hope.
How will this affect you? What's your? I'll just start right there. What's your take? What's your stake? Where do you want this to go? Where do you fear this going? What's the situation from your perspective, Jim?
Well, I'm not going to be coy about this. I'm a Trump supporter. I hope he wins. I was in 2016. It's not because I necessarily expect him to do great things, but I mostly fear what the other side would do if they were able to take power in terms of limiting what freedoms we have left, including free speech, freedom of the right to bear arms, and so forth. And, Trump, if he wins, I think we'll have 4 more years of stumbling along. If Biden gets in with his crowd, I have no idea what happens after that. I think right now our immediate concern is how soon will we know a winner, and how messy will it be when the other side inevitably accuses the winner of having stolen the election.
Yeah, I
think it will be that messy. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. That's a tough one. Like, because, under normal circumstances, you have one power it's a changeover. We don't have this kind of messy fight for power in the United States. That's not necessarily the way we do politics. I mean, media, which shivers at even the notion that something is going on with the election, or it's not transparent enough, or somebody needs to, I remember they asked Sanders guy, Weaver, they said, Weaver was arguing with the press and about the polls and about the elections being dodgy. And they were like, yeah, but do you think that it would negatively affect the image of the elections if you say that something's wrong with the elections? And it's like, yeah, if something's wrong with the elections, there's something wrong with the election. What's wrong with you? But in this case, so you're a Trump guy. Now, from the standpoint, for me, this boils down to, do you want foreign policy or do you want domestic policy? Donald Trump didn't start any new wars, even though he tried. At least, budged on one. Let's say it that way. Domestically, a disaster. And I don't know what Donald, he's going to get the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court in addition to multiple picks. That, to me, seems so, that's terrifying to me as a prospect. How do you process that? I mean, because, like you say, you're not necessarily on the Trump train, per se. You're just looking at it as the other team are maniacs. What do you think Trump's agenda is in the next time around?
I think his agenda is what it was in 2016, most of which he has not been able to implement. And right at the top of the list, and I should have mentioned that at the outset, yes, he has not started any new wars. He has not gotten out of the old wars, but he's made some small progress in that direction. He has not obviously been able to improve ties with Russia. In fact, very defensively, he has to keep saying, no, nobody's been tougher on Russia than I have. He has staffed his administration with a bunch of Bush retreads and Heritage Foundation and RNC warmongers and neocons. On the other hand, if you look at Biden's foreign policy team, people you see around him like Michelle Flournoy and Samantha Power and Nick Burns and Tony Blinken, I mean, they make Trump's team look like a bunch of Mahatma Gandhis. So I expect the worst if Biden gets in. But again, as I say, the immediate problem is that if it looks like tonight that Trump has possibly won because more of his voters vote on election day, but then we have a whole bunch of outstanding ballots in half a dozen states that haven't been counted yet over the next days or even weeks, and you get something like they call the blue shift, where we saw in some of the California districts in 2018, this is almost tailor-made for each side to accuse the other side of fraud, and with very unpredictable consequences.
That seems practically unprecedented. That seems, I mean, we talk about this often on the show from a sort of political science or political philosophy perspective, the transfer of power, how important that is for maintaining legitimacy, but also how if your government increasingly lacks legitimacy by various means, corruption is increasing, society stagnating, the economy stagnating in different ways, then you're more likely to get these scenarios where there is not a clean transfer of power. It seems like that's what we're headed towards now. What do you think that forebodes more widely for the American polity? Just backing up for a second, looking at this not in terms of 2020, but in terms of the 2020s. How do you think this is going to affect where our country's going, Jim?
I think one way or the other, the country is going through a very rough patch, and one that I don't want to sound too apocalyptic here. I don't rule out that it could end up with a civil war or some kind of a breakup of the country. I'm not predicting that, but it could happen. But let's face it, this is not just normal political divisions we see in America today. We see people that actually hate each other, that people who regard the other side as enemies. And that I think in a way it's even more divisive at an existential level than it was in 1861. It's not all nice and neat, though, between states the way it was back then. And I don't think anybody can really say what's going to happen over the next few years, except it won't be pretty. And I don't think we know how it turns out. I think what will happen is if Trump is reelected, it will happen perhaps a little more slowly than it would be if Biden gets elected. If Biden gets elected, I think we will see something close to what I would call a woke dictatorship, that we will see the acceleration of trends like shutting down free speech on social platforms, basically doxing and firing anybody who disagrees in any vocal way with woke ideology. I think we will see something like a soft totalitarianism. If Trump wins, what we'll see is something like we saw with the disorders of this year with Black Lives Matter and Antifa, but at a much higher degree, something closer to a kind of a planned insurrection. And by the way, I think that's one of the possible outcomes if it looks like Trump has won, something like a color revolution from the streets, but really being managed by the various elements of the establishment.
So I can see, so if Trump wins, yeah, I could see people losing it, especially from the establishment. But I got to be honest, I can't see a situation where Trump wins and that many people have died, even though I do accept that it is very possible for Trump to win this race. And put yourself in a Biden administration for the moment. I know you're pushing for Trump. What is a Biden administration's objective when they get into office?
I think the short answer is to maintain permanent power for a Democratic majority at the national level. I think we will see an effort to make D.C. and Puerto Rico states and give the 4 extra Senate seats. I do think we'll see something to try to pack the Supreme Court because of the anger over the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation. And I think in a way they will try to move forward with what they thought they had in 2016, which was a permanent Democratic majority and disenfranchising flyover country for the indefinite future. And I think they will be able to achieve that if Biden wins the White House and they take the Senate. If they don't, then things will be messy for a few more years.
A much more deeply entrenched status quo, basically. I mean, another way to look at this is something I was thinking about late last week. Trump, a rejection of the status quo back in 2016. In 2020, Biden effectively running against Trump. It's a weird mirroring thing going on here where there's a rejection of a rejection. On neither side, unfortunately, do I see much of a sort of positive, specific view of where they want to take America. Not what they want to save America from. In Biden's case, it's Trump. In Trump's case, it's Biden. But some specific, concrete policy recommendation. I want to move to that, actually. Assuming that's valuable. Assuming you would look to your leaders for leadership, not just away from some fear, but towards some specific unifying objective as a country. What do we need to get there? Assuming that that's the case. And again, I'm kind of begging the question. I'm assuming a bunch of stuff here, but assuming we want to do that. Jim, first of all, do you think we should want that? And if so, what do you think it would take? What do you think we need to get to that point as a country with leaders?
Honestly, I don't think it's going to happen. Maybe we should wish that would happen, but as they say, if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. And it'd be nice to think that somehow we're all going to hold hands and return to some kind of a civil discourse. And can we all come together as a country? And I guess my answer to that is no, we can't. And let's not cry over spilled beer. Let's figure out what happens next. And unfortunately, I think we have two incompatible visions of America. And I think you're hearing this increasingly from Trump on his campaign stops that, do you think this is basically a good country? Yeah, we've had problems in our past. We have problems today. But you have pride in our founding fathers and in the pioneers that traveled across the West and all of those sorts of things, the America that most of us older folks grew up in? Or do you buy the narrative that America is an irredeemably evil country, that it was based on genocide of the Indians and on slavery and segregation, and it needs to be burned to the ground and rebuilt anew in some new vision of what America should be? And I think that's really the dividing line between Americans on both sides of it's not just a partisan divide. It's, as I say, an existential divide. One of those visions is going to come out on top. Now, I think over the long term, the second one is probably more likely, largely because of demographics. But I don't know how that's going to turn out for the long term, and whether in the shorter term, some sort of break occurs in the American polity where those two sides clash in a more violent way than what we've seen so far.
Well, at another side of this, thank you for the answer. We've got to go into a break. Another side of this is, unlike 1861, the nature of war has shifted dramatically, where it seems we've been living in various stages of coup for the last couple of years, where the way that war transpires, the form of aggression that it takes, has to do with information and sort of mass propaganda and the use of these tools of mass censorship, mass suppression, but also mass support, where if you, Facebook, for instance, Twitter, you don't just suppress stories, you also boost certain stories. And there's this constant question of, there's a weird asymmetrical warfare thing going on there with anonymous people online. Anyway, that's a topic for potentially another segment, another time. Jim Jotras, we'll be back with him in a minute. For those listening, James George Jotras is a Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist, also an attorney licensed in D.C. and Pennsylvania. He has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court, previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer, and you can follow and should follow him on Twitter at Jim Jotras. Also, check out his website at jimjotras.info. Again, we will be back with Jim on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, and joining us, Jim Jotras. Jim George Jotras, let's put it that way. Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. He's also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia in Pennsylvania, who has appeared before the United States Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and a United States Senate staffer. Wow. Jim, let's hop across the pond for a moment and run across hop across one and run across a few land masses. I want to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, and I want to kind of I had to take a Benadryl this morning. My sinuses were horrendous. My face was massive, and so it's kind of screwing with my ability to speak right now. I'm sorry, but I apologize. But I want to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia and Azerbaijan had a military balance. They had to at some point. Russia was selling weapons to both. Now, if you're Armenia and you're watching these Azerbaijan get more weapons and everything else, why don't you do anything about that? Don't you have to do something about that? Why didn't they do anything when they saw Azerbaijan getting more and more and more weapons and military capability?
Well, there are a few reasons. For one thing, they don't have the resources compared to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has 3 times the population and a lot of energy wealth coming in, whereas Armenia doesn't have that. Armenia is part of an alliance, the CSTO, with Russia, so maybe they felt some degree of security in that regard. Plus, also the government that was, I think, installed in 2018 through another one of these color revolutions was trying to hedge its bets between its relationship with Russia and its relationship with the West. Although, frankly, from my point of view, that was never going to pay dividends for Armenia. So they were, I think, maybe they were a bit complacent, thinking they were going to be fighting a defensive war, or that the Azeris would be restrained by their also growing relationship with Russia from launching an attack. Obviously, that didn't work. Now the question is, what's going to happen in the course of this war? Will the Azeris be able to seize enough ground where they then want to cease fire and negotiate from a position of strength? Or will the Armenians now have an incentive to absorb whatever shock the Azeris have them, and then hopefully with Russian support plan some sort of counterattack? I think we're still in a very fluid situation.
Well, we're also heading into winter. That's another side of it. So, I mean, one assumption a complete armchair general situation here, no real experience. One assumption that the Armenians may have had is that the Azeris would be slow to make progress, would be slow to make gains. It seems like that's largely the case. It seems like it's not that we're at a standstill. People are dying, as far as I can tell, every day. But we're heading into winter, mountainous terrain. Even if you have drones, those drones are going to get less efficient as the temperatures drop. And certainly, mobilizing some sort of actual armed invasion, people on the ground, gets more and more difficult as time goes on. Is this literally going to turn into a frozen conflict? Do you see that happening this winter, or where do you think that's going to go, Jim?
I don't know if it turns out that way based on the current lines of control or something similar to it, that would actually favor Azerbaijan. And I don't know if the Armenians want that, or frankly, whether the Russians want that. There have been reports that the Russians have been supplying the Armenians with technology to knock down a lot of these drones, and that's not as effective as it was in the initial weeks of the war. And whether that is an indication of some reversal of the front line at some point or not, I don't know.
I'm curious. Independence. I'm fascinated by the topic of independence. Right now, you have the entire world who basically says that Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijan's. And yet, you have also the entire world saying, don't do anything about it. Keep it frozen. Basically, the world says, keep it the way it is. You have Armenia screaming independence. And you have Azerbaijan basically saying the situation is untenable the way the situation is, and meaning they're going to change it. With Turkey whispering in Azerbaijan's ear of all of the great things they can get. It is so bizarre. I'm one of the curious things about is independence. Like, what makes a state independent, and when should a state be given its own independence? It seems, why is the world so kumbaya about the situation staying static? It just seems such like an odd thing to me. Either the world needs to say, okay, yeah, that's Nagorno-Karabakh, that's Armenia territory from here on out, or basically the people who live there, it's their territory. But the world doesn't do that. Why? Why do we keep this, or why does the world keep this as a frozen conflict? I hope you know what I mean, if you understand what I mean.
Sure. I think maybe there's a kind of an assumption, well, the world says this, the world does that. Of course, the world doesn't do a thing. Who says things is various countries and various powers for their own interests. And let's remember the prime example of this is when the Western powers decided that Kosovo, a province of Serbia, should be independent, even though there was no legal basis for trying to impose that on Serbia, which, of course, not only Serbia is not recognized, but neither is Russia and China and India and most of the rest of the world. But that was a highly destabilizing move on the part of the Western powers, because it led, for one thing, immediately to Russia saying, okay, fine. And now South Ossetia and Abkhazia are independent. Because why? We say so. That's why. And so I think that's, in a way, sort of, you say, why just leave a frozen conflict hanging there? Well, sometimes that's because the alternative is for more war or attempt by some powers to declare a reality that other powers don't recognize. Now, in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, as the Armenians call it, this was an ancient region of Armenia. It's still mostly Armenian populated, and it was put in the Azeri Republic by Stalin in a way that really did not fit the demography. And this, of course, is some of the root of a lot of the problems in the former Soviet Union and in the former Yugoslavia. The Azeris now want to change this by force of arms. We'll see if that washes with the Armenians and also with the Russians. And as you point out, too, there's a huge element of Mr. Erdogan's adventurism in Turkey, who's in the process, it seems, of picking fights with every one of his neighbors.
Right.
How do you see this as different than...
Right.
Yes. Yeah. No, he's doing that. It's Syria, Libya, here. How do you see this as different from the previous incarnations of this conflict? This has been called the most dangerous conflict in wider Europe. I forget by whom, but it nevertheless was called, has been called that. Is this iteration different than the past ones? If so, how? And how could this escalate if it does, Jim?
I think it is. Sense that it seems that Baku is attempting what would be kind of a final solution to the Artsakh problem, that with a lightning offensive, a blitzkrieg, they could basically reconquer all of Nagorno-Karabakh, and then the corridor of, nobody disputes this, Azeri territory that connects Karabakh to Armenia, since they don't actually connect to each other. This is very similar in a way to the Operation Flash and Storm that took place in Bosnia and Serbian Krajina in 1995. We'll see if that succeeds. I think right now it looks like it still could, but we don't really know what the counter plan is from the Armenians and whether they in fact have one. The reason, of course, it's quite a bit different is because of the Turkish factor and the Russian factor, and perhaps also an Iranian factor. Despite the fact that the Armenians are Christians and the Azeris are Shiite Muslims, Iran has tilted toward Armenia because of its geopolitical interests and its fairly close relationship with Russia. Turkey, on the other hand, even though it's a NATO power, is pretty much estranged from everybody these days. We see this particularly with regard with France, where Turkey and France are in very bad terms, compounded by this issue of the cartoons and the killings in France and so forth. So there are a lot of, let's say, loose ends here that involve a number of powers on all sides. The Americans seem to be quietly backing Turkey, but not with a whole lot of enthusiasm. So there are a lot of loose ends here involving almost everybody in the region. And if things go wrong and explode, I think we'll find a lot of countries that could be involved.
I'm curious. What is Turkey getting out of this? Like with everything that's involved, and with all of the with them putting their, or let's just say instigating, in this particular conflict, like you said, they have their fingers in some of it everywhere. What are they getting out of being there? What's the point?
Well, there are a couple of ways to look at it. The easiest one would be that just like for President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, if they are able to win a great victory here over the Armenians, that would just be a political feather in Erdogan's cap. Some people are saying, well, this is to distract from domestic problems and so forth. I don't necessarily buy that. I think there are strategic goals here. One is that it has been a long-standing goal of Turkey to basically be the dominant power, not only in the Caucasus, but in Central Asia. In that respect, they've seen Armenia as kind of an obstacle, Armenia being a close ally of Russia's that blocks Turkish access to a much broader region of Turkish influence, especially since, with the exception of Tajikistan, all of the former Soviet Central Republics, Asian republics, the stands, as they call them, are other Turkic people. So there's an element of pan-Turkism or pan-Turanianism in Ankara's agenda here. And also under Erdogan, also pan-Islamism, that they have the idea of kind of a Sunni Turkish empire in Central Asia, even though the Azeris themselves are Shiites, not Sunnis, and not particularly religious people. But I think there is this broader sense of manifest destiny, if you will, that Erdogan in his own self-image as a new sultan has in Central Asia. But first he has to get the Caucasus, and the Armenians are an obstacle.
That sounds symbolic, but there's also probably specifically a geographical element there. Again, Nagorno-Karabakh sort of splitting Azerbaijan up in two as a region there, with the exclave on the west, and then the main region in the east. That sounds a little bit, we only have a minute left, but that sounds broader than just trying to reassert Turkey as a sort of new Ottoman Empire. If they're trying to get over to the stands, like you're saying, that's, as far as I know, wider than the former Ottomans, not their sphere of influence. Their sphere of influence definitely stretched there, but that's a big goal in some sense. Do you see any reality? Do you see any hope of that coming to pass, or is this just sort of chain of dominoes, one chance potentially leading to that scenario? What's your take, Jim?
I can easily see a scenario where he is overextended. And let's remember, it's not an either or. He is also trying to assert himself in former Ottoman lands like Syria, like North Africa, like Libya, and so forth. So who knows whether he has bitten off more than he can chew. But that's not necessarily something that will happen automatically. Again, a lot of it comes back down to the Russians. That, remember, all the areas we're talking about here in the Caucasus were formerly part of the Soviet Union, before that of the Russian Empire. That Moscow sees these as their sphere of influence. I don't think they really like the idea that Erdogan thinks he's going to take them away from them. Erdogan had his dust up with the Russians a few years ago when they shot down that Russian plane in Syria. I on one hand, it looks like the Russians got caught flat-footed here in the Nagorno-Karabakh. I don't know if they're going to stand for that. I think that's the big imponderable right now.
Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Wait,
those listening, Jim Jotras,
wait, Jim. Before you go, real quick. If they cut off the corridor in Armenia, to Nagorno-Karabakh, what happens? What takes place? We have about 30 seconds for you to answer, if you can answer in 30 seconds.
Well, I think the idea is if the Azeris can cut off the corridor that separates Artsakh from the rest of from Armenia, that the Armenians would have no choice but to sue for peace, and the Russians would also have to accept that, and then they would also find some way to work out a modus vivendi with Azerbaijan. But that leaves the Armenians essentially in a very vulnerable position. The Armenians have said this is not just about Nagorno-Karabakh, that this is about a potential replay of 1915 and the genocide of the Armenians by the Ottoman Empire.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This is Jim George Jatras, Washington, D.C., based government and media relations specialist. He is also an attorney licensed District of Columbia and Pennsylvania who has appeared before the Supreme Court and previously served as U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. I'm going to quickly drop a note. This is very, truly random. Great conversation with Jim Jotras. Enjoyed that. I picked up some raw milk yesterday, and it's delicious. And I'm drinking more milk than ever. That's a completely random note, but it's exciting. I've been trying to get this stuff for years in different places. In some states, very hard to find. You've got to go through these legal loopholes in order to get it. But raw, grass-finished, grass-fed milk, not that dangerous as far as I can tell.
You're on a farm, right?
I am not. No, I'm definitely not on a farm right now. But you can get it. That's where you would get it. Is from a farm.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know what's sad? My wife and I, we got married in Iceland. Now, Iceland freezing. So, they were playing with the name. And so when we were driving back, we were like, all right, we'll just get gas. There are no gas stations, like talking about once you get out of the main city. It's like there's nothing. It's just expansive, beautiful. But we didn't need beautiful in this very specific moment. We needed gas. But we ended up stopping to get this place to get something to eat. And you could hear the sound, like as you walk in. It's fresh. It's a farm. It's literally a farm. The restaurant is literally a front for a farm that's in the back. My wife walked outside for something. She says, I think they were killing an animal. Well, yeah. And we were eating the animal that we think that they might have been killing. Fresh food, man. Fresh food.
That's delicious. Yeah, that is strongly recommended.
Oh, man, it was so good. It was so good. Americans, it's like when you take out the antibiotics and all that nonsense that they put into the food, it's different taste. This is a different, they were fighting so hard to push back against the chlorinated chickens in the UK. In fact, when I call it chlorinated chickens, I call it that because it's derisive. It sounds funny, but it's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's way better that way. I mean, same thing with specifically, I'm still learning about this stuff, but it has to do with the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. So the ratios of these two specific kinds of fats, where broadly, as far as I can tell, again, a pleb here, omega-6s are inflammatory, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. If you're a cow and you're eating stuff that you're not supposed to be eating, you will naturally develop more omega-6s than omega-3s. You will sort of develop a disproportionate imbalance of the two types of fats. And this passes through your milk, it passes through your meat. Whatever form humans are consuming you in, they're going to sort of receive that stuff. And broadly, you want more omega-3s and less omega-6s. At least you want more of a balance of them. So that's really what it comes down to.
I think
trying to figure out deeper dietary stuff.
I think it's more interesting to ask, should you be eating a cow at all? That's where I think it's interesting. Like, that's the question. I mean, when we get a hamburger, for example, let's say a little child, we get that child, and that child will go to McDonald's. They have their French fries. Oh, they're so cute. And they'll get the little thing, and then have a little toy with it, and they go sit there and eat. Now, a month ago, that thing was a part of an animal that was kicking and breathing, that might have been abused, probably was abused, was packed in a stall that was, where it couldn't turn around, most likely, given antibiotics, injected with all sorts of stuff. I mean, basically, it's an animal that was tortured for God knows how long before she got her hamburger. And we all know this. We all accept this. In fact, when we had people who were showing what was taking place inside of those torture factories, they basically passed a law to prevent the person from showing it. Like, so that's what we are. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about, this type of stuff. Yeah, it's problematic, man. Our food, it needs to be in public control. I get weirded out when people, like corporations or companies, get their hands on our food.
I totally disagree with that one, but it depends on what you mean by public control.
Well,
I don't like big corporations owning it, but here's my alternative.
I was trying to make
like
a
family
larger point
farms.
about the kid eating a dead thing and the process that dead thing goes through to get to that kid's mouth.
Yeah. That's horrible.
Whether or not that's right.
I used to think of myself as like an attempted effective altruist, somebody who's working to be more effectively altruistic.
Yeah.
I went into these weird different directions. It starts off with like charity, and you're looking at the most valuable places to put your donations, basically. Like, how many lives can you save per dollar you spend? And it's something like $3,000 is the cost to save a human life at bare minimum. Interesting conversation there. Anyway, that community, no longer really a part of it, but that community went off in a bunch of different directions. Some of them turned into animal rights activists, looking at diminishing the total quantity of suffering experienced by animals, specifically in factory farms, but even more broadly in the wild. It gets into weird philosophical stuff there. And other sectors of the community went off and did stuff on far future research. Some of them just looked at, global poverty in the current day and age. Anyway, interesting conversations there. My current take on it, talking about animal rights, animal welfare, those issues, is we raised these creatures, we domesticated them, we oppressed them, whatever. They no longer, specifically in the case of modern cattle, that species no longer exists in the wild. And while factory farming seems like a travesty in a variety of ways, ethically in terms of its effects nutritionally on people, if you raise them well, if they're grass-fed, if they're living happy lives, which, if you're taking care of them, then they by and large are, they're living far better lives than they would in the wild. If you're doing all that stuff, then it seems good for every piece of that puzzle. It seems good for humans, and it seems good for the animals. It seems good for the environment too. If they're eating grass instead of grain, then the methane emissions go down. And broadly, you're building up pastures that will then capture that methane. So it's like this mutually beneficial ecological cycle. That's kind of where I am now with that stuff. But the chlorinated chickens are no good. We can agree on that.
Yeah, it's funny. I had a conversation with a guy, and that was my exact same argument. Because he was like, what does it matter? And I was like, dude, you mean, what's the difference between a life that's being tortured versus a life that's not? I was like, don't you take vacations? At which point you didn't want to talk to me. My point being, there's a difference between states at which a consciousness exists in. One can be hellish, and the other one can be glorious. My dog Bo, when we got Bo, nobody had pulled or talked to Bo or at all. Like, meaning nobody had pulled him out of the kennel for like 3 months. I can't imagine what he went through during those 3 months. And I know I'm saying he because it's my dog. Well, one of my dogs anyway. But I guess I'm making the point that like what that experience, that I can't quantify that. I can't, it's you can't get your hands around that. But it's pain at the end of the day. Okay, we do have a caller. So we have Brave and ATL. Brave, what's going on?
Hey, good morning, fellas. I wanted 2 points. The first one, I want to go back to that very first guest. I believe his name. I listened to a few times in there on this show. But you guys had a pretty strenuous debate about the Democratic Party and the Republicans and living under dictatorship and all of that stuff. I wish I could have said to that person that I feel that first I agree with you, Jamal, that is a very extreme example to make or point to make that we are living under dictatorship with Trump in office. The guy who can't get any policy passed, the guy whose own administration doesn't follow his exact orders.
And who's running in an election right now. It's like we're running on the so go to the polls, and get this dictator out. He's not a dictator, dude, if you could throw him out.
Point. Right, we're in an election to vote to get a dictator out. We're voting, right? So I would say to him that I think, if anything, the fear is that we are finding ourselves moving closer and closer to a fascist state by giving so much party over to the Democrats, who are working with Republicans now, to basically what seems to be quash all of our voices. When you look at what's going on in the media, especially with those things that came up with Biden and how social media working in campaign with the Democrats and I guess the anti-Trump movement at large to suppress journalists trying to speak out on it. That shit to me seems like it would be the scariest thing. But I listened to a show the other day where they had a guest on totally different station, Urban View, and this guy called in talking about the hip hop artists who were kind of weren't down for Biden to make it quick, and this guy went so far as to say these guys are both hardcore Democrats and Black Lives Matter supporter people. And they went so far as to say people like Ice Cube and black men who decide they don't want to vote for Biden or are telling people to not vote for the Democrats or to demand something for their voice. They literally said that those people should never be forgiven for the stance they're taking. They should never be forgiven for the stance they're taking. But at the same time, they made the argument that we should forgive the crime bill and all the things the Democrats have failed at doing to help us, as well as put in place to hurt us, specifically while Biden's been in office. So I found it to be amazing, and it's alarming because that in itself shows how we are eagerly pleading to have our rights stripped from us, to have our voice stripped from us, so that people get the government they deserve. But my second point was I'm a digital artist, and I would love to find out who can contact there at Sputnik to contribute to the shows, to volunteer my services to contribute to the shows. So those are my two questions. The latter being the most important, because the first point, we'll all make those arguments and it won't matter because the election is what the election is going to be.
Real quick there, Brave, thank you for the call. I don't know exactly what you're indicating, but you can always send faultlinesradio@gmail.com and email. That's one good way into it. And yeah, we can do it from there. Brave, calling in from Atlanta. Thank you for the call. Tarif.
1 minute.
Tarif on the line. Giving you about 30 seconds here, Tarif. What's going on?
Okay. If Trump loses this election, what he should do is give Joe Insider support and everybody else as whistleblowers. And also look into my case. He should also release the files on church committee that investigated COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, and the assassinations of a whole bunch of people in this country that the U.S. was involved with. So everybody, when Joe Biden is in office for the next year or two, people can be looking at the files as people staying inside on lockdowns and stuff like that.
So, Reef, I 100% agree. These are just interesting ideas, including the part about pardoning Julian Assange.
30.
Be a good last hurrah for Trump, assuming he loses this one, which it's still up in the air. In any event, to Reef, thank you for the call. Thank you to our listeners for listening. Thank you to engineer Andre for engineering. Thank you to our producers, Cam for producing. And thank you to Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, for hosting this show, doing a great job as always. And thank you again to you, listeners, for staying tuned. We'll be back tomorrow doing.
Something was going on with Shane's voice at the end, but this is Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan, and I want to thank all of you for joining us on this show. I'm stepped up. I know it looked like hell today. I'm sorry. I can't help it. But I will see you guys tonight for the election coverage. I'll see you guys later tonight. Wait one second. Let me check, make sure. Pop Reality. Thank you so much, Jamal, for your experience. Thank you, Pop. Marcus Will. Science didn't lie. Fauci lied. See, that's why I keep saying I don't think that's fair. And what do I mean by that? Why do I keep saying it's not fair? Why do I keep saying it's not fair? If I gave you a task, I said, hey, all right, I'm getting this new house. And you come in and you say, I'm giving you this job. You said, great. Here's a toothbrush. That's all I got. That's all I got. And I need you to, this place to be spick and span in 10 minutes. Well, it's impossible. The task is impossible. You can't clean it with that toothbrush in that span of time. I'm making the point that Fauci was put in a similar situation. Now, would you lie to me and tell me that? Should Fauci have said the president of the United States did X and so I can't do what? It's a political situation. And Fauci didn't even lie like talking about. Fauci was following the guidance that everybody else was giving out. And if you really read the statement, Fauci was still telling you why he was telling you that. And it was because he didn't have enough. I guess everybody picks on Fauci on this point. And it's like, it's not, the issue isn't Fauci's. First, science is a tool. That's all science is, no more, no less. It allows us to peer into our world, into our environment, by using a conceptual tool. This notion of hypothesis, testing hypothesis, falsifiability, all of these things are principles that science applies. Fauci and what the public was watching was science working in real time. Oftentimes, you see this stuff after the fact. They know how to make this after the fact. But what you are seeing is science in the moment, learning as it goes along. Because that's all they can do. It's not magic. And so initially, we don't know if it's, airborne. Well, it's a respiratory illness. It's probably airborne. But they don't have enough masks to go around because the president of the United States didn't ensure there was enough masks. So this is why I actually say, for example, say it's you. Say I'm the president of the United States. Let's say we have a mock thing. I give you, there are 50 masks, 20 emergency professionals. There are 100 people in the room. What do? Now, do you tell everybody that they have equal access? And think about what I'm saying here. If everyone has equal access to the mask, what happens when the emergency room people need them? And why does Fauci even in this situation in the first place? Fauci's in the spot because the president of the United States didn't do his goddamn job. Real talk. That's what's going on. So it's like you're giving me a task and I don't have enough resources to do the task. So it wasn't that, so it's like people can hit Fauci, But really, the reason that Fauci was lying because of Trump. Think about it for the moment. Do you honestly believe that Fauci, who's been saying the entire time that this thing is getting worse, this thing is going to get worse, this thing is going to get worse, and he is coddled to some degree or hobbled because of his political associations with Trump, and then Trump threw him under the bus. So, yes, Marcus, technically, he lied. Jim Vento, Trump or Biden, take my right or left eye. Want a choice. I feel you, man. Unfortunately, fate took mine, my right one. All right, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks all. I'll see you all tonight for election coverage.